And we are live. This is Dark Journalist. Oh, it's great to have so many people out there in the ideas room already tonight. Of course, tonight I am joined by the lovely Olivia.
Hi, everybody.
And Olivia, this one is going to go deep. Now it's interesting because when we get into celebrities and Hollywood and the music industry and all the rest of it, there's already a huge kind of preset mind set going on in relation to it. People already have certain ideas, they've seen certain specials and all the rest of it. Well, I'm going to suggest a few things tonight that will kind of deconstruct some of the things we've heard along the way, and also some of the sensationalism that's been brought in, especially around Marilyn. But the thing that I'm suggesting probably is even more sensational in the grand scheme of things, because it includes a great big aerospace presence. And a lot of the things I think that we've heard of make sense in their context, but always the big thing is kind of left out. And a lot of the people who, for one reason or another, had to leave that big thing out at the end of their lives actually came out and told things. But at that point, it had already been cemented in the consciousness. Oh, the mob was involved in JFK's assassination. Marilyn's thing, it was either an overdose or she was murdered, and it's all been left kind of in this weird haze where they can come out with a book about it here and say, well, actually, the JFK assassination was all related to this Mafia Cuban thing, and here are all my stats to support that. Problem is, over time, those arguments haven't really held up. And we all know the official story is bunk. So if the official story and the counter stories don't add up, then what do you do? Well, you go into an area that has always been heavily, heavily avoided in this case. And what happens is the Marilyn Monroe exit from stage left provides us with a very interesting context for all this. That is, her death scene, interestingly enough, gives us a major clue as to what the entire wave of deep state activity was all about there, getting directly into the UFO file, and the extraordinary people that were involved in this struggle, including Marilyn herself, JFK, of course, RFK, and the deep state. And certainly the mafia was around Hollywood and they were around politics. But so much has been laid on the mafia that I think tonight we're going to open up with some great answers. Tonight, X Series 172, Marilyn Monroe, Deep State, JFK, UFO File Mystery. And this one is a revelation, so it's mystery revealed. It's great to have a great crowd out there tonight. A couple of things I wanted to open up with right off the bat is, just before we started tonight's show, all this news came out about a juror in the Trump case who may have let it out to a cousin, possibly, and that cousin went on social media saying, hey, my cousin let me know that Trump's going to be convicted. And if so, this would be kind of jury tampering right off the bat. That case is so flimsy anyway that it doesn't stand a chance in any real court. And so the kind of bizarro scenario of this sentencing of Trump July 11th certainly, doesn't go over very well. But what's interesting to me is that this came up and, they're going to drill it down really quickly, but it's no question that the court judge, Mershon, who, presided over this disaster in Manhattan, which is really one of the worst cases ever brought, conviction, one of the flimsiest convictions in history, where the judge was like, find him guilty on this or guilty on that, but just come up with a guilty verdict. You all don't have to agree. Well, that's jury's supposed to be unanimous, right, Judge? Gee, you're the one who went to law school. But we can see that was all manipulated to interfere with this election. But where does this conversation go? Well, Merchan is the one who sent this out now, and he sent it to Trump's lawyers and to the state prosecutors. Of course, the case itself, it's so bogus. I could be here all night talking to you about it. But one thing I'll say about it is the charges relate to something that's federal, and it's a state case, so it never should have been brought. That's what you hear from real legal experts, from Turley to Dershowitz and all the rest of it, who are on the left. I mean, there's no bias there. So pretty much, the collective understanding and idea is that was all a kangaroo court in any case. But we're going to get into some of that tonight because I think when you're seeing things like this, these could be exit strategies also by the prosecution, seeing that their case didn't go so well. And so they had these things hanging out there that would nullify their own case. That whole bit about Hunter Biden and all this nonsense about his gun trial and all that. None of that matters. I can tell you, don't pay any attention to it because they're not going to do anything to Hunter Biden. And that's not
Slap
even
on the wrist.
Yeah, that's not the real case. What you would charge him with is, finagling with international oligarchs, over in Ukraine and other places, and kicking that back to Stepford Biden. This stuff about, oh, he lied on a gun permit, nobody cares about this. And this is literally the thin stuff that they're going to do. And then they'll be like, make sure you improve your life and keep doing that fascinating artwork you're doing. I think there is a lot going on around the political aspect. And I think that with campaign 2024 heating up the way that it is, we're in a very strange place with all of it. And right in the middle of it, you have the UFO file piece again coming up. Now, a big thing came up, which said that, AARO, the UFO Defense Office, had demanded every government UFO document be submitted by October 20th. This is interesting to me because, they kind of deflated with Grush. They rolled him out there. And I think in part because of part of the skirmish with Chris Mellon coming out and some of the weird overtures of Grush to me and all the rest of it, that they were overplaying this whole thing. And I think that they decided to bail out on Grush and to kind of repackage him. And then they have Lou Elizondo, they're coming out with a book of his in November. Now, it's very odd because, as I mentioned last week, these guys have been coming out and saying, oh, I'm putting this out there because I don't want to be suicided and all the rest. They're still government contractors. So that this whole, like, I'm a whistleblower, I'm going to be suicided thing is a real manipulation and kind of disgusting. Now, what's weird is in the middle of all this, Stephen Greer, who I don't class in the same level as the CIA threat operators. He's a totally different track. But he comes out and says this thing, oh, I've got a dead man switch if anything happens to me. And then Russ Coulthart, the Australian, I'm scared guy, let's not forget. This guy comes out and says, well, I have inside sources that told me Trump wanted to come out about the UFO file, but he was threatened and he didn't want to be assassinated, So if there's all this very, very loose talk going on, I don't know where it's coming from or what the goal of this is. But and you had Danny Sheehan coming out and saying, oh yeah, Blue is right. He's under threat. I don't know what their game is, but these are the same people who work for the government. They're the ones who promulgated the whole UFO threat. And they're the ones, if anything, who work with those agencies that do assassination. So, I mean, aside from Greer. And but this whole development of this party line of everybody saying, I'm under threat. And, I remember talking to Grush, and he was telling me that he thought that he had been threatened. And I asked him if it couldn't have been, and I always take that kind of stuff seriously, regardless of the context. And I asked him, well, don't you think it could have been Elizondo and that group trying to whoop you into a kind of a hysteria so you join their party? So, that got him thinking, and he certainly thought that Elizondo was capable of it. So it's interesting to me, all those things that go back and forth. What we know for sure is that Mellon and his ilk really pushed these guys out there and put a lot of money behind them. Well, what did they do last week? They launched the UAP Fund. This is a UFO nonprofit to raise money for their little hijinks. And this can become, depending on how they do it, of course, but it could become quite a money laundering situation. And it could become the central pool of funds for anything that goes UAP, as it were. So a lot of these little...
Okay, if I donate, what am I supposed to get out of this if I'm an investor?
It's a good question. I wouldn't recommend anyone...
No, certainly not. But I just wonder, what are they promising? Right?
Oh,
because we've been down this track before.
Yes, exactly. Well, they've jumped in. Before they said they were working on, new propulsion methods and stuff with TTSA. That all went away. And these guys, they don't have the ability to let any of that stuff out. What's interesting to me, though, is that they are trying to corporatize and create this brain trust idea so that they are the ones, the authorities to go to, because they're a little worried that in the independent media, especially, people will reach out to all these different people in relation to the UFO file. And unfortunately, I've mentioned with Tucker Carlson and other people, they'll reach out to people like Lou and think they're legit and the real thing. And so on one hand, they're like, I'm against that government. And then they're like, here's CIA agent Elizondo. So it doesn't add up. And this is a very difficult approach as far as the independent media goes. Nobody ever gets it. And I have to say, even on the Joe Rogan thing, and it's okay to have fun with the show, but he had Billy Carson on there. I mean, that is Gaia TV. That's like, Billy Carson, Corey Good. It's the whole Gaia TV fake space thing. So doesn't speak too well for where the independent media is going. And it's interesting because I think there could be a totally different track on it, much more potent with much more real information. And I'll tell you, the real stuff is a lot more interesting and a lot more fun than the entertainment stuff. But I'm appalled. I'll put it to you that way. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. This is X Series 172, Marilyn Monroe, Deep State, JFK UFO file mystery. And JFK falls right in the heart and the center of this. Of course, last year we put out the Blue documentaries, which presaged all the government announcements about Kona Blue. And we let out Kona Blue and the whole Blue program to you guys in the ideas room a year before the government did. And then the government came out and was like, oh, here's this big revelation. And, a lot of these publications fell all over themselves. Well, we put out the same information a year earlier. And what's interesting is the government said, yeah, this program existed, but we never used it. So there. I feel like this gets us into interesting territory because there could be at times an effort on the government side to say this thing has come up, something, authentic has come up out of the independent media, and we do need to address it, but let's shut it down, or address it with a different junk conspiracy. So you see a lot of junk conspiracy, a lot of mixing going on around the junk conspiracy field, where you'll take a real thing and they'll throw in this other thing. Now, that's a central tenet in what I call dark journalism, which is you have the official story, then you have the secondary story, the real dark journalism, where, a lot of professors, writers, and other people come in and poke holes in that official story. And then out of nowhere, you get this third wave, and that is the junk conspiracy. And that's meant to drive people away from questioning the official story. So they go back to the official thing because they're like, oh, this other stuff is too crazy. You have to watch out for that, especially in this environment, which is market heavy. And I think some of the things that we saw, like that Rogan thing, look, with somebody with a platform like that can do fantastic. They can really inform people. They can bring on the best people. They can have very exciting shows. Instead, they're rolling out Gaia leftovers. I mean, that's pretty bad. So hopefully their producers are listening. They take a good long look in the mirror. I had someone write to me and tell me that they felt that if Robert Kennedy didn't join the Trump ticket, that Trump couldn't win. And I thought that this was interesting. One of the things I've tried to bring forward about the 2024 election and how it has a lot in common with previous elections, including the 1960 election. As a matter of fact, it's funny, we have all these things about elections now. We're like, oh, you can't talk about election interference. That's anti-democratic to even mention it. And one of the books that was like a hit job on President Kennedy was called The Dark Side of Camelot by Seymour Hersh, who wrote good stuff before that, but according to Professor Scott, got conned by the CIA. And it turned out a lot of his sources turned out to be no good. But they were all like, yeah, JFK used to drop acid at an orgy, There was a lot of this, and they did a lot of damage to Kennedy's image. But one thing I think that's interesting is, again, that's this massaging of the public face of things, and you have to be especially careful of that. So one of the chapters in that book, though, is called "Stolen Election."
Mhm.
That came out in 1997. They would just talk about, things where they would go back and look at a particular election, just say, hey, stolen election. But if you do that now in relation to some of the elections that have been going on in the past few years, it's supposed to be a big strike. Oh, you're misinformation. Oh, how dare you even mention the possibility? Every election is always great. No, it's not. And, people have gone to jail in the past over election interference, and it happens. LBJ, who became president when he got into office in 1948, he got in, with a box that showed up at the last minute with 500 votes that were just for him. And what's interesting is someone who saw the car that drove up with it said the people who got together in a graveyard, put all these ballots in this box and drove it off to the state house and dumped it in. This is how things
Juicy.
this is how things have gone.
Box 13.
So yes, box
Mhm.
13. And it's interesting because although LBJ is sort of a footnote in this episode, John Connolly, his very early associate, believe it or not, shows up here in a very kind of dramatic fashion. Before we go any further tonight, I also want to mention, especially if you're new here, to go to the darkjournalist.com website and sign up for our newsletter. That's a free newsletter, and it keeps you and I in touch over this tremendous, absolute smothering censorship that we have going on in relation to all the things that we put out that we've been able to navigate around. And I don't like to make too much of a big deal about it, but the best way around the whole thing is to be on that newsletter list. That'll let you know about the incredible, and I mean incredible, shows that we have coming up for you, including X series episodes that will blow your mind, incredible interviews that are coming up this summer that will absolutely be off the charts, and election coverage, documentaries, as we just put out Hacking Atlantis in May, and that's still just coming up for air. People are still discovering that because of the heavy censorship on the channel and the work that we do here at Dark Journalist. Make sure that you do check out the CRAZE and the Hot Zone there. Hacking Atlantis, which is a 90-minute documentary. It's right on this channel. It's free to the public, and it's under immense censorship. But there's a lot in there, and a lot of it pertains to deep state elements involved in archaeological interference, shall we say. That's the way I would look at it. But in any case, if you're on that newsletter list, it's going to keep you, updated and informed. And also, if we have events coming up later this year, you want to be first in line and stand up and be counted. Make sure you're on that list. Before I go any further, Miss Olivia, what's the temperature out there?
Everybody's really excited for the show. M. Leland says, ooh la la, MM. And Giza Death Star Community says, I think there are very deep levels to the Marilyn Monroe thing that have never come out.
Oh my God, absolutely. Well, this is someone, we're going to get an insight into Marilyn by finding someone who was, um, you know, also a lover of President Kennedy and who was used as an intermediary between major figures. And it's Judith Exner, and Exner is so important. I've tried to stress her in my research, and I think that her testimony, as she came out, layers of testimony came out, and at a certain point when she was terminally ill, this beautiful Hollywood model, she she came out with the rest of the truth. She felt, well, the mafia story, the deep state hitmen no longer can touch me. But her story is going to give us a particular insight into the legendary bombshell actress Marilyn Monroe, who is a really multifaceted person and really was one of the most famous celebrities of all time. Her movies are still fantastic, and she still is, set the bar for where actresses would aspire, especially for that kind of light, almost comedic role that she could play, and she could play serious too. But her whole air of celebrity was the kind of charisma that you just, it's very hard to get that. It only comes sort of once in a generation. And there have been a lot of retelling of the Maryland stories, and I think some of them have gone some places, but they've been missing core aspects, and they've been drawing in. They're just kind of stuck on the relationship, the salaciousness of the relationship, and then the kind of titillation around mafia stuff and celebrity. There is another aspect in there, and we're going to be able to find that aspect. It's a human intelligence aspect, human, as it were, that President Kennedy used. And this is something that, in my research, I found that he learned from his father, who was absolutely, as a major social climber, business genius, political, uh, kind of strategizer par excellence. And I feel in retrospect that President Kennedy had much more of an ethical radar than his dad. And so I think that part of what President Kennedy brings into the White House with him, part of the legacy of his dad is still kind of interfering with where he wants to go. There's a famous quote by Bobby Kennedy where he said, they say the sons take on the father and the sins of the father. And he's like, how many years do we have until we've kind of outlived the sins of the father? So there's something there with Joe. And yet I can also say about Joe that, he had incredible qualities, and he was trying to instill an ideal of perfection, and idealism into his children. And obviously it worked on a number of levels. But there are problems there because Joe came out of an era that is particularly the 1920s, which was lawless, and where, in certain towns like Chicago, the machine guns ruled the streets. And so, this was somebody who was navigating in that environment, prohibition, all that lawlessness, where all the gangster uh, pieces come from, that whole archetype of the period. And of course, the Great Depression afterwards, and somehow he had done so incredibly well that he thrived through it all. Um, Now, what I've been seeing is that we've been looking through the lens of Kennedy a little bit without Joe enough. And once you get the Joe piece, then things start to make sense. And I'll tell you a story about this that we can kind of kick things off with, which is Frank Sinatra, of all people, who's right in the heart and the center of this. And of course, we have a Sinatra episode coming on.
He's in the center of the X, if you really want to get down
Oh,
to
yeah, there's no question. There's no question. As a matter of fact, as somebody who was the mediator between that deep state world, the mafia, and the presidential realm, and the entertainment world, I mean, there's kind of nobody who was better at it. Very close to two presidents, President Kennedy and President Reagan, and had a very strong Catholic overlay. And came from very difficult circumstances. I think I've mentioned this before, that when he was caught for petty crimes when he was younger, breaking and entering and things like that, it came out that the relatives around him would talk about how his mother beat him rather regularly when he was a child. And so you can kind of see this extra quality in Sinatra, which is there's a kind of a drama there. And when you read about his various relationships and things, very often he's a depressed, shaky, sensitive character underneath all that bluster. But there's a real drive to be kind of the number one contact, and to have, the president as a good buddy, and to have the top mafia guy as a good buddy. But in 1981, he wanted to open a series of casinos, and he, in the 60s, had to get out of, things like Cal-Neva, which I'm going to get into, because there were great crackdowns. And so when he wanted to reemerge and open up these casinos, a lot of these congressional committees were like, no. They were like, only if you give congressional testimony and give some people up. Because there was this understanding that he was deep in with the mafia, even though he never confessed it. So, we have to kind of get on that level with him. What he does is he comes forward and he says, I never knew Sam Giancana. I think I even had him removed from my lodge at a certain point when he was causing problems and all the rest. Well, his friends and family all confirmed that he was very close with Giancana, and I have all kinds of pictures of him. I have some that I'll show tonight with Giancana. And Giancana also is an unusual mob boss and godfather, a little bit beyond the usual stripe. But one of the things that Sinatra will say at the end of his life is that just before the 1960 election, that Joe Kennedy called him to a secret meeting in Hyannisport and said, I want you to get in touch with Giancana, and I want that help to get Jack in the White House. That's the goal. We need Jack in the White House. And he confirmed it. So obviously showing that deep relationship that he had with Giancana, one, and two, going on the record saying that it was Joe Kennedy who reached out to him to get in touch with Giancana. Now, it shows up unusual later, this whole thing about Giancana, because we get into deep details with the Judith Exner story. And what she's saying is that Sinatra introduces Giancana to her as Sam Flood. And I should say that Judith Exner is a major breakthrough in all this. And I think it's how we can understand the Marilyn piece. And then when we bring in the Marilyn piece, we're going to have kind of the fundamentals down in the middle of all this. And one of the things I think that's very important for us to keep in mind is that this intelligence network that President Kennedy had built up was a fantastic way to get around the CIA. They always wondered, how is he doing these things without us being able to track him? Which is why they always had sophisticated bugs from the CIA and the FBI tracking the White House. Now, what's interesting is there's a tremendous leap in the technology if you look at it in 1957 and 1958. Surveillance technology, recording technology, bugs and things. When you go from late 40s and things and what the FBI was using, they make such a huge leap by the time you get into the Kennedy era that it is a whole new thing to catch up with. And God knows that's just what we hear about what they were using. So Kennedy had all kinds of ways to get around this. And one of them was revealed later when he was sending messages back and forth with Khrushchev, and nobody knew how those messages were getting around. And the way that it was getting around was in these very sensitive issues, he would give this journalist a letter, which had his presidential seal and everything, and say, sit in this particular cafe in Washington, D.C., and then someone's going to meet you there, another journalist. You're going to hand him this newspaper that has the letter in it. He's going to take a plane, go to Berlin. Someone's going to meet him, pick up the newspaper, and bring it to Khrushchev. Khrushchev's going to bring it back. This is how the network was organized. Now, Judith Exner Campbell was probably one of the most major liaisons, but I'm suggesting here that Marilyn played a similar role for Kennedy with a few individuals. And a couple of things here about Exner. I did an episode on her, which was called Female Targets. And she was an actress. Her sister was an actress. And she married the actor Thomas Campbell. And he had some popularity and some fame in the 50s. He was in a Star Trek episode as Trelane, of course. But she divorced him, and she was 25 years old when she met President Kennedy in Las Vegas. And she had been, put into the situation by Frank Sinatra. And Sinatra, at the same time, had also introduced her to Sam Giancana. Now, that combination there is pretty volatile under any circumstances. And what it was used for later was to portray the whole Kennedy assassination as, the mob, got him from behind the scenes and he was sleeping with the mobster's girl and all this stuff. So there's a lot in this story around Giancana. Let's get into some of these details. So if we have then Joe Kennedy wheeling and dealing behind the scenes. By the way, there's a very interesting scene in Ronald Reagan's biography where he talks about Joe Kennedy coming to him behind the scenes and saying, I want your support for my son. I know that you are a Democrat who's supposedly going Republican for Nixon, but I'm willing to do X, X, and X things to get you behind John's candidacy. So, Reagan was like, thanks very much, but I'm not going to do it. I'm Nixon all the way. So you can see that it was Joe Kennedy behind the scenes doing this. Joe Kennedy had a very low profile in the 1960 campaign because he had a tremendous baggage from the period of time around World War II, just before World War II, when he said, we're going to have to deal with the fascists sooner or later, and fascism may be coming to America and things of this nature. And FDR fired him as UN ambassador, as the ambassador to the UK. And the whole Kennedy family, which had gone over there, had to come back as well. And this is a very interesting thing because Jack Kennedy, when he's over there during the time that his dad is ambassador, picks up on how the House of Commons works, and he picks up on the Royal House. And so his level of government understanding is far beyond, say, an average congressman or an average senator. He's seen this other system, and his dad has been right in the heart of it as ambassador. And of course, before that, as the SEC, the first SEC commissioner. And there's a famous line where, they ask FDR behind the scenes, like, isn't it Joe Kennedy, the one who basically did all of these weird deals during the whole, ratcheting up period on Wall Street that sort of ended up in the Depression? Why are you putting him in as the SEC commissioner? And FDR said, what you do is, if you want to keep an eye on all the rats, you get the chief rat. So that's the way that he regarded Joe Kennedy. And he also saw him as a potential rival for the presidency. So he wanted to give him a job to sort of keep him happy. And it worked for a while, but Joe had big ambitions for his son. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. This is X Series 172, Maryland Deep State, JFK UFO File Mystery. Getting some idea of the players here on the Kennedy side: Judith Exner, Sam Giancana, Frank Sinatra, and of course, the legendary actress Marilyn Monroe. We're going to be taking your questions in the second half of tonight's program. We'll go about 2 hours with you tonight. And Miss Olivia is putting those questions together now. Miss Olivia, how's the temperature out there?
Good. Tina Borch says Joe Kennedy's mistress was, of course, Gloria Swanson.
Yeah, this is another. This is so hardcore because what you have is JFK's life. The way that they talk about it later is like, oh, hey, the mafia shows up. Oh, hey, Hollywood people show up. It's Joe Kennedy's life, really, because Joe Kennedy had gone through all of these things. And so
the pattern was set.
It was. And when Jack Kennedy gets involved, when he's roaming around Hollywood, when he's in the Senate looking at the presidency, this is sort of a replay of his dad's life. And it is, in some sense, his dad living through him, as he wanted to live through Joe Jr. Joe Jr. was the person that Joe Sr. had picked to be president, the oldest son. He had set him up for it, and he died, unfortunately, in the secret mission during the war. Suspiciously died as well, which is also odd. The suspicious deaths around the Kennedys go way, way back, just like the weird deaths around the Hemingways do. Now, it's interesting. One of the things I'll say is that Jack wanted to be a journalist first, and he wasn't particularly interested in politics. But then the mantle is kind of thrust upon him. And in 1946, he becomes a congressman, goes to Congress, and then 1952 wins a Senate seat. And then everything from there is feeling out his way to the presidency. There are weird moments leading up to the 1960 presidency. 1956, he's trying very hard to become the VP for Adlai Stevenson, who is a terrible candidate, has already lost to Eisenhower. But Kennedy has set it in mind that if I'm VP there, that this will be the doorway to the presidency. And it doesn't happen. And he gets a call from Joe Kennedy, who says, look, this is the greatest thing in the world. It's the greatest victory. And Jack Kennedy says, what do you mean? I lost getting on the VP ticket. He said, that ticket is going down like the Titanic. Don't worry about it. So they're all, they have a lot of political savvy in the Kennedy family. And there's a lot of very unique connections that they have, including Joe McCarthy. So by the time we get to the 1960 election, here's what's going on. Joe Kennedy realizes that his son is in a perfect position to run for the presidency, and Jack Kennedy wants the presidency. The thing is, the major challenges on the board are that Nixon is coming out of the Eisenhower administration, which is perceived as kind of stable and very like cold warriors. And so they represent kind of the old guard. Kennedy is young. They didn't have a young president in that period for a long, long time. And he's the youngest president ever to be elected at that age, 43 years old. The youngest president to serve was Teddy Roosevelt when he gets thrown in there as VP at 42. But 43 was young in that period to be president. So he has to overcome that, and he has to overcome the Catholic thing, maybe some rumors about his Playboy activities. So they're looking at the situation very hard, and they need to make a number of overtures to different groups. And one of those groups is the Mafia. And the Mafia controls the Teamsters and all this other thing. And Nixon has a lot of Mafia help on his side. So there's a lot of organized crime activity in the election. And by the way, organized crime is not something that, is just an anachronism. It's just organized crime has kind of been absorbed a little more in the current society, but there's heavy duty Mafia activity in what we're looking at.
Well, the CIA kind of absorbed their action.
No question. And there's a lot of
hostile takeover.
Well, there's a lot of consolidation, but I think that those things also, move their base of operations, for example, to South America in some cases. But it is interesting to look at this period because the Mafia is in a real zenith. It's kind of one of the heights of their power. And so in this environment, what happens is Kennedy meets Judith Exner through Frank Sinatra. And Sinatra, remember, has been tasked by the dad. We don't know if Kennedy himself has any knowledge of this, which I find interesting. Could be the dad did a lot of things that he thought, I can get around Jack and promote him behind the scenes without him even knowing. But in any case, Sinatra gets this situation going with Judith Exner, and they have a very well-documented relationship. This isn't one of those kind of flyaway books or whatever. There's over 100 entries in the White House logs about her calling, and people remember her coming and going and all the rest. Now, also, Exner is Catholic, so they have a lot of these things in common. What happens at a certain point is that he says, I've heard through Frank that, Giancana, I want you to give him something. And I want you to arrange a meeting and hand him this. And he starts doing this. And then at a certain point, he starts instructing her to meet with defense contractors. One of them in particular was a scientist who was working on an aerospace device. And this comes out a little bit later because people were naturally assuming that everything he was sending through Judith Exner was some kind of payoff or whatever. Well, she never looked in the envelopes that she was giving back and forth, but she said that she was trailed by security on one hand, by the Kennedys, and then these other people who were also tracking her actions. So there's all these intrigues about it. And it's a heavy duty thing to put this kind of 25-year-old actress in the middle of, after all. But she was doing it for him. And this is part of that human intelligence network, as I said, that JFK used. If we can get our minds wrapped around this, the rest of what we're talking about tonight is going to make sense. So what happens is, at one point, she's like, I want to know what's going on here. and she gets a package from one of these defense contractor people, and she's like, are they paying him off? What's going on here? And she opens it up, and it's a series of blueprints that look basically like, rockets or some kind of propulsion system. She puts back quickly and wraps it up and delivers to him and never talks about it. But what's actually going on here is twofold. On the Giancana side, he's trading notes back and forth, and everyone thinks, oh, the basic CIA line is, oh yeah, Kennedy was involved with us in trying to assassinate Castro, because it puts them on the same level. They can say, when it comes down to it, look, the CIA may have assassinated Kennedy, but he was involved in trying to assassinate Castro. So there. And always attaching him to their plots. And remember, the deep plot around assassinating Castro came from Nixon and Howard Hughes long before Kennedy got anywhere near it, and Allen Dulles and this whole gang. And there are weird things about the Castro piece in this as well, and it's going to be able to all kind of fit this scenario. But the next piece that I think is crucial about Exner is, I think that what's happening with Kennedy sending messages back and forth through Exner is that he's asking Giancana, the CIA came to you and said, we want you to assassinate Castro. I want every detail of what they offered you and what they plan to do, so he could stay one step ahead of them. For me, this makes sense because they created a huge drama and setback and incredible worldwide global defeat for him in the Bay of Pigs invasion. So he wanted to be one step ahead of them. And one of the ways to do it was to use the mafia figures that they were using, get information about what they were saying. This is the kind of back channel. And Giancana thought he had it made, because he thought, I'm dealing with the president and I'm exploiting this whole relationship, and he's going to ease off me and all the rest of it. But there is a problem there where there's a disconnect with what Bobby Kennedy is doing. And I think at a certain point, Bobby Kennedy becomes overconfident that he can eliminate this influence of the mafia over the democratically controlled unions. Now, that whole union thing is very important because of the amount of money that's in there. So the pension funds and all the rest. And with that money, these groups, the mafia groups, are taking things like all the Teamsters pensions and opening up huge casinos in Las Vegas and other places. And they're becoming their own power block. So I think that Bobby Kennedy takes a look out at that. They say he was a cop at heart anyway, but I think he's looking at that strategically and saying, this thing is going to, the deep state is going to have so much money and control that unless we stop them now, we're not going to be able to maneuver with these people. And what happens in this process is that President Kennedy is kind of, letting his brother go into this mafia prosecuting thing. But on the other hand, he's also working behind the scenes with people like Giancana. Now, I don't believe, and there's no evidence that's ever been presented, ever, regardless of what you hear, that the Kennedys were involved in anything about assassinating Castro. I don't believe that that's what was going on at all. But I think that they were tracking the CIA plot of using the mafia to do this. Now, another thing that's also an error in the literature around all of this is that they say, oh my God, this whole thing about the mafia being used by the CIA, they decided out of the blue to use it in relation to the assassinating of Castro and all the rest, as if that's when they invented this idea. And they go back and they get this guy Sheffield, and they were like, it was his idea. And the person who was actually operating the whole thing about assassinating Castro with the mafia through the CIA was Richard Bissell, who again is a major aerospace signature in the intelligence realm. He's the guy who controls all the Blue Book files, for example. So we have to kind of reimagine a lot of these things. Also, if you look at the work of people like Professor Scott and others, you're going to find that the mafia was working with the CIA all the way back to the 1948 elections in Italy, where they asked them to interfere because they didn't want the communists to take over. So this idea that they just kind of came up with this, in 1961 out of the blue, and that was some crazy whim. No, the CIA worked with organized crime. That's the way it was. And also, our understanding of organized crime has to be improved to get the correct lens on that period. So when I read a lot of the mafia books, it's about, the mafia and CIA had a link. They all go back to this idea like, it started with the Castro thing. What a big mistake. And Richard Helms went before a congressional committee and said, I wish we hadn't done that, but we were desperate to hold those Soviets back. They'd been doing it. The deep state had been organized way, way earlier. And if we get that earlier piece, we're going to understand everything that comes afterwards. The next question for us to answer is, how does any of this relate to Hollywood and then the UFO file? That's where we're going next. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. This is Marilyn Monroe, Deep State JFK UFO File, Mystery X Series 172. What we're going to do is about another 30 or 40 minutes, and then we're going to take your questions. And Miss Olivia, before I go any further, what do you got?
David Termina says, DJ, Joe Kennedy found himself in the middle of the deal that Eldridge Johnson made to sell Victor talking machines to RCA and merge it with Kennedy's RKO Theaters. Their new logo, a Tesla tower.
Oh, fascinating. Think about that. And here's a weird thing about Kennedy, which is something that Professor Scott brought out. Everyone talks about Cal-Neva because it became the center of all this activity, mob activity, Hollywood activity, blackmailing politicians, everything. And it's called Cal-Neva because it's right on the border between California and Nevada. And it was owned by Giancana and Sinatra and a few other silent members. Here's what's interesting. If you go just a little bit deep, you're going to find Professor Scott said, but who owned Cal-Neva just before those guys came in and took it over? Joseph Kennedy. So Kennedy already had Cal-Neva before these guys. And so before you get into, Marilyn was there at Cal-Neva and she was being blackmailed. Giancana was there. They took pictures of her. There was this whole exploitation. I know I'm jumping ahead, but before you even get to that, you have to factor in the piece that Kennedy already knew all about Cal-Neva and his dad had owned it. So, that gives us a totally different spin. Again, this stuff had already been playing out in the 30s and 40s. And then in the 50s and 60s, you get another version of it. Yeah.
So was Cal-Neva used back then when Joe Kennedy owned it in the same way where there would be orgies with Hollywood starlets and maybe blackmail?
Oh, yeah. I mean, it was kind of the ultimate in some sense because you had the biggest high rollers from Las Vegas plus the Hollywood connection. So you had them both in there together. And what you find is Marilyn spending at the end of her life, she's at Cal-Neva almost nonstop. And it's a little bit like Laurel Canyon will be a little later with the hippies and that whole scene and the record executives spilling out all this money and drugs to keep everybody happy. It's kind of a controlled environment and heavily manipulated by FBI and CIA forces trying to get information. So in a way, it's got a lot in common with Bohemian Grove. We can think of it in this sense. But it's pretty alarming if you go back and you realize in that chain to think of it as, this kind of mafia and intel exploit place, and then who owned it just before Sinatra, Joseph Kennedy. So these relationships there's something there in those relationships that runs very deep and is old. And what I'm going to suggest here is very unusual, which is that something in the deep state that has to do with the drug trade, which the mafia was so essential for, at times when they needed money that had to be off the books in a hurry, they needed a system for it. So something we would see as kind of drug dealers, controlling their neighborhoods in the 30s and 40s, and the kind of muscle and things for their takeover, this gang owns that, this gang owns that. Later, you would see the same type of activity with the Contras and all the rest of it, and all that money that flowed in, and then suddenly, places like LA became awash with crack and things like of these types of investigations. There's an arm of all this which has to do, on one hand, with intense military activity and the need for intense off the books cash. And the blackmail side obviously rolls itself in there as a kind of control piece. And of course, we have people like J. Edgar Hoover and all the rest of it who do not bust Cal-Neva. They leave it alone, just as they leave H.L. Hunt alone and all the rest of it. It's understood that these people have the power to operate in that kind of crime realm. Yeah.
Well, or did they utilize it for their own purposes as well?
Oh, there's no question. There's no question. J. Edgar Hoover in particular was well known to take the freebies from H.L. Hunt, and also to have his kind of, gay parties and things that were just anathema to the culture at that point. And if he was found out, forget it. So there were all kinds of sort of triple down blackmail games going on. You could explain the Marilyn story and her death, etc. I'm going to bring that into focus here. You could explain it from a point of view of, oh, she's going to call this press conference and let things out. We have to bump her off. That is kind of the sort of straight ahead thing. And what that press conference was going to be about, for example. There are some very unusual documents that have been vetted over time by people that suggest she may have been privy to information through the Kennedys relating to aerospace and secret projects that were being pursued there. She may have relayed some of that information to friends like Dorothy Kilgallen, and those people may have slowly let out things. For example, Kilgallen was writing about the UFO file in the late 50s, and she seemed incredibly knowledgeable, including about crashes of unknown craft and the incredible secrecy around these things, even writing about the Roswell incident, although it had been long expunged from 1947 and wasn't rediscovered again until 1980. I want to say here for the record, too, that a number of books came out, and they were all about, Kilgallen's death, and they were very interesting books. Mark Shaw was the guy who wrote the original book about 5 years ago, I'd say, or maybe even further, 2016, somewhere around there. Then, very weird thing happened with that. They took the whole Kilgallen story, which had picked up some momentum in terms of public interest, and they turned it into a Bobby killed Marilyn theme. And then it was the mafia rubbed out JFK. The CIA was trying to prevent it. I mean, this is getting ridiculous. Then Mark Wahlberg, of all people, buys the rights to that. Now he's going to make a Netflix series about Bobby bumping Marilyn off. This is how this stuff plays. I talked about the danger of this, the counterfeit conspiracy, the junk conspiracy jumping around. And this is the danger that we see right in the heart of this, just like they did with the Casolaro story, where they had this journalist dress himself up as Casolaro while he's telling the story. And stretch it into all these different places, including some important people and connecting some dots, but then throwing it into this junk conspiracy place. So you have to watch out for that. It's more active than ever, and I'll say this, Tucker Carlson and a bunch of people on the conservative media and really big platforms were promoting this guy, Tate, Andrew Tate. And I don't want to go into a big thing about Andrew Tate, but I will say that, his main claim to fame is conning all these women into working on webcams for him. And I don't know what's going on with some of these alternative and independent, these waves that are running through independent media, as if to say, well, this guy, if he's anti-establishment, then that means he's good. He has something to offer us here. We see a lot of junk conspiracy being mixed in with the whole MH370 story, and a lot of real research. there were books and all kinds of things about it when it happened in 2014. And it's very important about the disappearance. And then what do? Oh, hey, here's the junk conspiracy part of it. Just like the driver did it in the JFK thing.
Mm-hmm.
Hey, guess what? It was UFOs that gobbled up MH370. How do you like that? There's the junk conspiracy for you. So you're going to have to sharpen your focus if you want to get to the truth of these things. If it's just entertainment, then have fun. But I think we're looking at very problematic territory indeed, because when you start to get into junk conspiracy on this level and it's promoted, remember what I call the rules of dark journalism: the official story, the secondary story, which is the real dark journalism, and then the junk conspiracy, which is to throw you off the track and get you back to the official story. They did that in the JFK assassination over and over again. And they'd have to throw something out there, and they did it with 9/11 as well. Give you something so outlandish and put all this stuff behind it that you couldn't sort it out, and people just go, oh, Jim Mars would say to me, this is obfuscation. That you give them so much stuff, they just say, oh, my head hurts, give me back the official story. And Mars really got it, I think. So when we're looking at this, we need to understand that when they come out in the Kilgallen part, gain some traction, that they put an overlay on this attacking Bobby Kennedy Sr. And there's no evidence anywhere that Bobby Kennedy had anything to do with Marilyn Monroe's death, although there's tremendous evidence that they were trying to set him up for that because of his relationship with her at the time. And also, there is evidence that Marilyn was very, very upset and frustrated with the Kennedys, and that she was going to out these relationships. So
because she was having a feminist moment.
Yes, but the thing is, they'd had a number of people who were like, in this kind of realm, who one way or another, they had learned to work the situation out. And it's interesting to me that when you read deep into the Giancana Double Cross book, which is written actually by his nephew, and it is all about what Giancana's brother learned during this period. It was actually the CIA who came up with the contract to whack Marilyn, as it were, to get rid of her, because they were worried that their activities relating to what they were doing, and I'll do the superficial part, the CIA mafia link, for example, but their major surveillance on Kennedy, etc., they didn't want to blow it with this whole thing that Marilyn was going to come out with. Now,
this may be a good moment to ask the question of exactly how many people were bugging Marilyn's house at the same time.
Incredible. Yeah. And this is, as I said, the technology had improved very heavily. As a matter of fact, they said that Marilyn was even bugging Bobby at a certain point, that she had recorded him. And this gets into some testimony by Jeannie Carmen, who was a close friend of Marilyn's. And she is somebody that I think had powerful, powerful information. And she was kind of a B-movie actress, and but she certainly
mostly
knew
a pinup model.
Yeah, she was a pinup model,
burlesque queen,
and she had a relationship. She was first neighbors with Marilyn, and then she went from there to even a more different place where they became regular companions, hanging out. And they would party at Cal-Neva together, and she knows all those people. And there's lots of documentation and pictures of her involved in these. So what we'll do is we'll actually, the last thing that I'll mention here before I jump to Jeannie Carmen and then to Marilyn is to say this, that there's no question that Judith Exner had been put out there by Kennedy to trade information with Giancana, and that it put her in a very perilous situation, and that she did not seek any kind of spotlight from this, but she was discovered in phone records through these different panels in the 70s, and they were like, aha, she had a relationship with so-and-so, let's dig into her. And she had to come out and at first give these kind of denials like, well, yes, we did have a relationship, but I don't know anything about anything else. And this is right in that period where Giancana is being called before the Kill Kennedy committees and being like, what do you know about this? And 10 days before he's to give his testimony, of course, he's blown away. And so some of these figures that we know now commonly, like Johnny Roselli and Sam Giancana, we've been allowed to know who they are. And there's a reason for that. Yes, they were right in the heart of these activities for years, but they were kind of the little piece that were being thrown to the crowd about all this. And try to figure this out. Whenever you get a new investigation into the Kennedy assassination, which even then, in the 70s, so it had already been 15 years or so. Whenever there was an investigation around the Kennedy assassination, high level, high profile deaths. And of course, Roselli himself, who was a lieutenant of Giancana and had worked in Las Vegas and had been at the center of all these different activities for years, politically and with organized crime. He's the guy who says, yeah, there were plans in that CIA thing to get rid of Castro. There's no question about it. But you know what else they talked about? They also talked about getting rid of Kennedy. Well, they didn't want testimony on that, so he showed up in Biscayne Bay there in a drum. So we have to remember the field that these characters were playing in. At a certain point, the deep state saw them as liabilities, and they were holding the biggest secret, which is what was behind the assassination of President Kennedy. And that's why Exner is so crucial, because she was put right in the heart of it. And then after the assassination, kept this incredibly low profile, was put up and propped up by these committees in the 70s after they discovered her relationships. And then in the later 80s and into the 90s, finally told the real story because enough time had passed. Well, Jeannie Carmen actually has a very similar pattern, and we're going to get into her next. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist X series 172, Marilyn Monroe, Deep State, JFK, UFO file mystery. You're getting a lot of background here, but it's going to pay off when we come to this next piece of revelation. I want to mention, especially if you're new here, to sign up for the Dark Journalist newsletter at darkjournalist.com. Go to the website and sign up for the newsletter. It takes about 30 seconds. And that will make sure that you stand up and be counted on the newsletter, that you get around the incredible censorship that we have going on. And that'll let you know about the remarkable interviews we have coming up. There's some interviews that I'm setting up now that are going to blow your mind. And of course, we're going to bring back some of our regular powerful guests, people like Gigi Young, Dr. Farrell, and others. It's a great schedule of interviews coming up. And remarkable X series episodes, documentaries, new documentaries. Of course, we just did Hacking Atlantis, the Craze in the Hot Zone. That's a 90-minute documentary dealing with a very, very deep mystery around archaeological wars in the Bahamas. And you're going to want to check that out. Lots of Edgar Casey information, Steiner information in the heart of that, in the whole strange trip around Ernest Hemingway. I want to mention, interesting characters show up on the X series sometimes. And tonight you're going to find out that Marilyn was obsessed with Abraham Lincoln.
Really?
Yes. Now, I put it on the record that Marilyn was into anthroposophy and was someone who was well steeped in the Rudolf Steiner teachings. I don't know if I've mentioned before that she got a reading from Edgar Casey in 1943.
She was very young at the time.
She was, I think, about 18 years old.
Mm-hmm.
And it was all about beauty aids. Very interestingly enough. So interesting tie over there.
Clever girl.
With Marilyn and the mystery schools. That would be it. But she had a genuine interest. The Lincoln thing I find quite fascinating because she'll be very close to a president, as we know. And that president, JFK, will have incredible parallels.
Wow, God, I hadn't thought of that.
Yeah. Now that's the weirdness, right? And that, is that reincarnation? Yeah, quite possible. But there's always that thing about people saying, well, the Kennedy-Lincoln tie-over is rather dramatic. And it's not just, a coincidence. I mean, it's quite, the odds are just kind of remarkable on the things that happen there. And it's interesting too, because friends who knew her when she talked about Lincoln said she was absolutely obsessed and wanted everything Lincoln related. And when I went into this a little bit, I found her at every major place where Lincoln had given speeches, Lincoln museums, taking pictures with Lincoln busts. And, this was a personal hero to her. So by the time she gets to Jack Kennedy, it's quite fascinating because she's already hooked on the presidential image, and which is also kind of a father image. And did somebody exploit that in the background, trying to get her, to activate that aspect of her psyche? I'll tell you why I think that. There's a transcript of a tape that Marilyn made with her psychologist. Now, this psychologist, Ralph Grayson, is one of these characters that shows up as a kind of a handler. And,
kind of.
his daughter is there working, always getting her wardrobe ready and all this other stuff. There's hanging out with the daughter of your psychologist, your psychiatrist. I mean, I think that's frowned upon.
Mm-hmm.
Would be.
Yeah, where are the boundaries?
Yeah. Greenson's interesting also. One of the people that he suggests to Marilyn is this, woman who will become her housekeeper and all the rest. And she's there. She's the one who gives the big story when Marilyn is supposedly found after having committed suicide, quote unquote. Well, this is fascinating because she was digging into her background a little bit, which happened much later, 20 years later. She was a psychological nurse, and it was Greenson and his network that she had worked for. So, in fact, Greenson has the daughter spying on her, the housekeeper spying on her, and his sessions with her. I mean, there's a lot of control there. And in fact, he shows up on the day of her death as well. But there was an investigator in the LAPD, and he didn't quite, he was a little bit unconvinced. And he said that, what bothered him was that Greenson had a very leering demeanor when he was answering questions, and he felt like he wasn't being helpful. So he was kind of hounding him a little bit. And Greenson said, well, I'll tell you what, I'll play a tape for you of Marilyn. And as long as you don't reveal what's on that tape, I will give you, access to this. And then you'll really understand what was going on and why, Marilyn's dead. So they sat down, he listened to the whole thing. So he gave all these interviews later, the investigator, and he said, well, I can't reveal what he told me, but I can tell you this, she didn't commit suicide. So then somehow he got permission from the family, and Cy Hirsch published it in his hit job of a book against Kennedy. Nonetheless, there's a couple of things in that book that are still worthwhile. I'm going to read you part of the transcript from that tape, which hadn't been revealed up to then. And this was what was on the tape, and it's in Marilyn's voice. So she's speaking this. So here's how it goes. Tell me that this doesn't sound like MK Ultra programming. Why they're doing it and who's behind it, in this case, Greenson, is quite fascinating. Here we go. From the actual transcript of Marilyn in her psychologist's office. Marilyn Monroe is a soldier. Her commander-in-chief is the greatest and most powerful man in the world. The first duty of a soldier is to obey the commander-in-chief. He says, do this, you do it. He says, do that, you do it. This man is going to change our country. No child will go hungry. No person will sleep in the street and get his meals from garbage cans. People who can't afford it will get good medical care. Industrial products will be the best in the world. No, I'm not talking about utopia. That's an illusion. But he will transform America today like Franklin Delano Roosevelt did in the 1930s. This is all Marilyn. I tell you, doctor, when he has finished his achievement, he will take his place with Washington, Jefferson, Lincoln, and Franklin Roosevelt as one of the great presidents. I'm glad he has Bobby. It's like the Navy. The president is the captain and Bobby is his executive officer. Bobby would do absolutely anything for his brother, and so would I. I would never embarrass him. As long as I have memory, I have John Fitzgerald Kennedy. Now,
what is it? So that reminds me so much of the Manchurian Candidate. What is that little diatribe that they go on about him being the greatest?
Yes.
That Sinatra
right.
does?
He's the greatest, kindest,
Yeah.
most intelligent officer I have ever known. That's really true.
Mm-hmm.
And the Manchurian Candidate comes up quite a bit. That is very Manchurian, the MK Ultra speech that she's giving her psychologist. And when he plays that for the cop becomes, oh, I can see it. She was obsessed with the president. Now I see what you mean. But there's something else to it. It's almost like there's a kind of a mantra in it, as if he's programming her to a certain level to be so obsessed with President Kennedy that, their relationship goes off a rail and she thinks that she's going to be the first lady. Now, this is the weirdness because, of course, in those relationships, we don't know exactly what they said. But one of the things we get from Jeannie Carmen, who is a very close friend of Marilyn's, is that she thought first through John, she was going to be first lady. And then through Bobby, she was like, he's going to be president in 1968. I'll be his first lady. Now, Marilyn Monroe had come from nowhere and nothing and become one of the greatest celebrities on planet Earth. And, operated at a tremendous talent level, even with her issues that are well known. So what she set her mind to, the fantasy became reality. So here she is now jumping to this next level of fantasizing about being the president's wife and the first lady in the White House and all the rest of it. And she keeps saying, can you imagine, me, Norma Jean, as the first lady? And she's blown way past the dream of being a Hollywood starlet. She's already conquered that mountain. And she really, she hates the whole studio system and the misogyny and everything else that goes on there. This is, with the Lincoln thing and all the rest of it. But you can't help but think that Greenson is feeding this so it will come to a boiling point. And I think that's where the next stage of this is going to take us. Before we get to that, let's get a little more of Jeannie Carmen because she's right there working in that Cal-Neva environment around the Giancana, Sinatra, JFK, Marilyn vibe.
Can I throw something in there?
Yeah, sure.
So Amaretto Eye says memory ? And that is the weird word in there that just is a giveaway. And
as long as I have memory.
Oh, it's so strange.
It's funny you said Manchurian Candidate too. Check this out. So Sam Giancana, he's been hauled back from Mexico to America, and he needs to testify at these Senate hearings about did the CIA, attempt to kill Castro, and what do you know about the Kennedy assassination and all this stuff. He's supposed to give his testimony. He has all this security outside, which is the Chicago Intelligence Unit. And by the way, he's in Oak Park, Illinois, which is exactly where Hemingway was. And there's a lot of interesting crossovers around Oak Park. Now, what happens is he's there and he has a friend who's right above him. And the friend's like, hey, I'm watching a movie tonight and, then I'm going to go to bed. Do you have everything you need? And he says, yeah, I'm going to make some sausage here and I'm going to watch The Manchurian Candidate. And he watches The Manchurian Candidate with Frank Sinatra as the lead, who's trying to figure out how he was hypnoprogrammed. And this is fascinating. During that period of making sausage and watching The Manchurian Candidate, someone walks in there with a silencer, shoots him, And then across his mouth draws this pattern with bullets, which is basically you talk too much. And he knew so many deep level secrets, but he was also very well protected, had his own security outside and the Chicago Police Intelligence Force. How the hell could this guy get in there? And the guy does it so kind of, well and professionally that the person who's upstairs doesn't even hear it. But nonetheless, the idea of him watching Frank as his sort of final meal with sausage there is pretty heavy duty. All right, Jeannie Carmen, you can't get around her. She's right in the heart of this story. What a bombshell starlet right in the middle of it all. And she loved that whole thing from Arkansas. And she had left as a teenager, gone off for the lights in the big city. And she became a favorite around Hollywood later. She was sort of moved through the system by Johnny Roselli and Frank Sinatra. So here she is at a Halloween party with Elvis. I mean, this woman got around. What happened is when Marilyn died, she's one of the last people to speak to Marilyn. And Marilyn was saying to her, I don't have any sleeping pills here. And called her at 9:30 at night. And what she had learned is that, Bobby Kennedy was in this relationship with her and was basically blowing her off now because she was getting very intense, probably with Greenson's help. And he had learned that she was keeping notes about their conversations. And she said it was to look smart in front of his friends. But supposedly she was keeping notes now relating to very sensitive areas. And both he and Jack had apparently trusted her to keep these things on a very private level. And so it goes that he came back very upset that day and was supposed to be in San Francisco and never have visited her that day, but they helicoptered him in, and he had this meeting with her, with Peter Lawford, who was Kennedy's brother-in-law. So there's a lot of weird things. What's that?
And pimp.
Good
time to mention that.
Yeah, right. I'm going to mention Lawford. Lawford has a lot of sort of sensational stories, including like being face down naked in the desert and having been picked up by Secret Service and all that.
Yeah, Wolf Mother says Peter Lawford was a sketchy dude. That is for sure.
I've known people like that. So Jeannie later on will come out and tell her story about what happened, because what's going on with her career and all the rest of it is as soon as Marilyn dies, there's no more Jeannie Carmen in Hollywood. There's no more movies. There's no more Cal-Neva. There's nothing. She disappears and she goes to a little town, which is a fantastic town now in Arizona, called Scottsdale. And at that time, it's a small place and she can kind of blend in and disappear, which is what she does. And she raises a family and all the rest. And she is told there's a number of things now that happened on that night, which is she didn't like the sound of Marilyn, and she knew there was all this kind of chaos going on. And then Marilyn had told her, I am going to throw a press conference and all these things. And that she'd kind of try to talk her out of it, thought it was crazy talk and all the rest of it. But Marilyn had gone through a couple of particularly depressing weekends for sure. And she was in an erratic state, but she was not a suicidal person by any stretch of the imagination. And all of the forensic evidence by Thomas Noguchi later would say, there weren't any pills or capsules dissolved in her stomach. This isn't a person who committed suicide by taking pills. However, there was a certain drug in her system, and what was learned later by looking at different stories of people who were involved, like Giancana's brother talking about it later, was that she was basically given an overdose via enema. Suppository. So, and this is a technique that the CIA used very well. In the Giancana book, Double Cross, which I think does have some important things with it. All of these books have the important facts and then a ghostwriter kind of framing it as a Hollywood script, So you have to, it's very easy for me because I know the people and their interviews involved. So when I get to the books, I can pick out what parts came directly from their knowledge base. And what I can tell you about the Double Cross book is that Giancana was interfered with because he was told by the CIA, you need to figure out a way to eliminate Marilyn Monroe in the middle of this. And he said, well, you're getting all this information from her. What's the problem? As a matter of fact, some of the things that had happened at Cal-Neva the previous weekend suggested that Marilyn had been drugged and that one of the people who were involved in sleeping with her was Giancana, and that she knew Giancana. So, there was this whole thing that was going on there. And what happened was there was an attempt by forces inside of groups like Hoffa's group and whatever, who wanted to pin all of this situation or expose it all to embarrass Kennedy to get him off of their neck, and also to expose that whole administration. This was their great goal. But the CIA didn't want to blow their whole situation right there. They wanted to cut it off, actually. And they figured the best way to do that was actually to shut Marilyn up in this situation. Now, it's often assumed that this is all about, what they were doing in relation to assassinations and planning with the mafia and all the rest of it. And I understand how that comes up, and there are elements involved there. But I want to take you into a different piece of this, which has to do directly with aerospace. In order to do that, I'm going to have to take us into Carmen's story a little bit deeper, and then to understand how Marilyn's undoing is related directly to this aerospace project and information around that getting out. That's where we're going next. Coming up for air, though, Miss Olivia, what do you got?
Rotten Cryptobit says Marilyn was used and snuffed. It's what the deep state does. Najat Madri says, who inherited Marilyn's estate? There has to be a treasure trove of information in her possession. Of course, everything was cleaned up that was useful that night.
Peter Lawford had instructions on getting rid of anything that tied her over to the Kennedys at all. And her tapes were taken up by a fellow named Fred Otash, which I need to bring in here because Otash is crucial. He's the one who is kind of like, what they say is that the Jack Nicholson character in Chinatown was patterned on Fred Otash. A couple of interesting things.
Right, because he's a former cop, right?
Yeah, he's a Marine, and he becomes an investigator, private eye, and then he's the one who digs up salacious things. And then what he does, it's quite interesting. He formulates all of this blackmail information and then turns it into a magazine with a publisher named Confidential. And Confidential was the thing where they would, have the jump on all of these stars, and nobody wanted to be featured in that thing. And
it's
nobody
like the
could
Inquirer
get out. Well,
of its day, right?
Even much, much worse, actually. But yes, that's the vibe in general. So a couple of things here. I wanted a couple of really keen shots. That's Senator Kennedy with Frank Sinatra in Las Vegas in 1959. So starting to get into the world of the Rat Pack, and of course his dad is seeking his help. These are kind of like selfies that Sinatra and Lawford and Marilyn are taking. This is the environment of Cal-Neva. Now, during the bit about Kennedy's inauguration, this is interesting. Robert Kennedy didn't want Sinatra to handle the inauguration, but Jack Kennedy was like, we owe it to him. He did all this stuff. And he said, all right, but he has to fire these people that work in his casino and at Cal-Neva. And he comes up with this big list. And Sinatra's like, no problem, I'll do it. And then as soon as the inauguration is over, Frankie hires back all of the mafia dudes. And RFK calls him up and says, "You cannot have those people working there." And he says, "You know what, Junior? I have a relationship with the president now, and there's nothing you can do," and all the rest of it. And Bobby says, "Oh, really?" And he goes to Jack Kennedy and says, "You're not dealing with this guy at all." And uh, Kennedy says, wait a minute. I'm actually supposed to go stay at his house. We're not West Coast fundraiser. Like, we made all these plans, and can't you do it after that?" And Robert Kennedy's like, "Absolutely not." And what happens is that Kennedy ends up going to Bing Crosby's house instead, and that's the end, because all of the connections that Sinatra had built, and this whole thing of looking great for Giancana and all this different mob people, now were all shattered, and he was being thrown out, basically.
Doesn't Sinatra destroy the
Yeah, he had an
helipad
airfield, helipad field built
with his
for
bare
Kennedy
hands,
to stay there.
right?
Well, he didn't build it, but he destroyed
No,
it
he
with his bare
destroyed it
hands.
with his bare hands. That's how angry he was.
And they say that, by the way, the Marilyn Sinatra relationship was platonic and friendly. I don't believe that.
He slept with everybody.
I think that they are sleeping together, but that is interesting that they had the kind of friendship that you could say that, hey, these guys are spending a lot of time together, but they're not going out. But she was a regular at Cal-Neva, and Sinatra is moving her around just like he's moving Exner around to meet these bigwigs and to, kind of get along in that environment.
Right. And Marilyn lived for a while at Doheny Drive with Jeannie Carmen
Right.
in a
Frank Sinatra owned building.
Exactly.
Yes. So
that's where he kept his chicks, his broads.
True. I want to do just a little segment here with Sinatra for a moment. And then let's see. So here's how we'll do it. We'll play out for about another 15 minutes, and then we'll go to your questions.
Okay.
Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show X Series 172, Marilyn Monroe, Deep State, JFK, UFO File Mystery. Yes, they're huge celebrities. Yes, a number of things have been said about them, but on another level, they were incredibly talented people, and they were caught up in a maelstrom of deep state activity that was threatening their careers, threatening their lives. And so we have to kind of look at them and admire them, and even admire their mistakes at times, really to see that they were dealing with gigantic forces outside of their own control. And that the reason that they were even involved in any of this is because, again, their talent was being exploited. And that's the only way to look at it. And in some cases, they let themselves, through their various activities, get hooked into the system. And so they had ups and downs in that relation. But I do want to look at them not so much as kind of a, this freak show of celebrity, but more the depth of the people that we're talking about. I think they did have a lot of depth, and they were targeted very, very heavily, as we see that deep state piece will target for drugs, for entertainment, the music industry, for that whole kind of the real Illuminati piece, as it were. Sinatra had stated unequivocally to the congressional board, that panel that came up in relation to him opening casinos in 1981, that he had never met or hung out with Giancana, and that if he had seen him, he'd been in the same environment or whatever, it was just because the guy had been there, and but everyone else says that was complete BS. And there's a shot of Sinatra, and there's kind of a reverence there. You can see it right off the bat between the two of them. I want to mention that one of the things that got Sinatra in so good with the mob, and he grew up in the mafia. I mean, his mother ran a tavern where they had performers and all the rest of it. It's a little club there in Hoboken, and all the mafia, the Costellos and all those people would go there. Bugsy Siegel, so it's a mafia upbringing. And it's a violent upbringing too, with his mother being violent to him. So he's kind of coming into it. He's sort of born into it. So whether he chose it or not is a little bit different. But there's a family called the Fichettis, and they're very interesting in early Sinatra lore. So what happens is there's a big Congress that happens in Havana in the 40s, and all these mobsters meet, and including Giancana is there, and Frank Sinatra is basically the talent that comes in. And so he's in tight in the mid 40s with the mafia. So the Fischettis, they say to him, you like Cuba so much during this trip. How about if you come here and guess what? Maybe you can bring us some stuff. Oh, what am I going to bring you? Well, let's say that you're interested in art now, and you can, in this art kind of setup, you can have your palette and all the rest of it in this box that we'll give you when you come into Cuba. And so there are all these trips that our friend Sinatra made into the hot zone with all of this art equipment. But it was suggested later, and law enforcement was keeping an eye on him, thinking he's actually transporting money laundering directly into these casinos in Cuba. Thank God he didn't get busted for that. But Sinatra was surrounded by this influence, and I'd say later he tried to shake off the gangster image. And I think this confession at the end of his life that that Joe Kennedy had tried to get him involved in the election of President Kennedy is significant, because it's kind of him clearing it up, because he didn't have to say it, as it were. So Jeannie Carmen and Fred Otash. Jeannie Carmen, as I mentioned, Marilyn's roommate or housemate for a certain period of time, certainly friends. And she had a lot to say about Marilyn, and that, this is somebody that she felt was used. One thing I want to tell you that's very interesting is I found a picture of Jeannie Carmen with Trump. I didn't expect that, nor had I heard anything about it, but there indeed is President Trump with Jeannie Carmen. So, Trump and the Trump mafia overlay, once you realize the amount of work that he did in Atlantic City, the Trump Towers and all the rest of it, there's a big Trump mafia signature, and it cannot be got around. So one of the things that Jeannie says, and I think this gets us right into what happened there, is that when she hears this stuff going on, that, Marilyn may have overdosed, she tries to drive over there, and there's a huge scene of police, but there's other people, plainclothes people, that are looking at her. And she takes off, and when she goes back to her apartment, she's assaulted, and the person turns her around, and someone she knows. It's Fred Otash, who was a private investigator that Marilyn knew, and who had also spied on Marilyn, and also had been hired by Marilyn to spy on other people. And there's a lot of this going on. Frank Sinatra had a lot of spies, it seems like that was the nature of what was going on back there. Otash is quite fascinating because, like I said, he started confidential. He was going to out Rock Hudson as gay back then. But instead, he was able to sell that information to Rock Hudson's wife, who wanted to get out of the relationship and get a payoff. So there's all kinds of things that this guy was involved with. But what's interesting is there's a couple of unusual things about this encounter. One is he says, do you know what happened with Marilyn? Basically, the killer showed up and they bumped her off. Now, he said, you are going to hear from Johnny Roselli, who she knew, and he's going to tell you, to get out of town, basically, and don't deal with acting, just disappear into the woodwork and don't say anything about this case. So Otash approaches her in her apartment, gives her this threatening warning, and says that Roselli, who was the Las Vegas mobster that she knew through Sinatra and everybody else, this guy is giving you good advice and saying, just leave town, get out of it. Now, Roselli would be called, as I mentioned before, he would be called through a number of JFK committees in the 1970s. And he would give them information. Yes, the CIA was hiring me. And the CIA had to admit, yes, we were hiring gangsters to assassinate Castro. and pretending it was the first time they'd done it when they'd been doing it for years. Now, in 1967, a series of articles came out that were starting to suggest that this whole thing about organized crime in Cuba. And it looked like it was an attempt, or some version of an attempt, to shut down any aspirations that Bobby Kennedy had to become president in 1968. And the person that they were using to leak those stories to Jack Anderson was our friend. Now, why he would participate in this or implicate himself in this is very interesting. Why would Roselli, by the way, that's a phony Italian name, he's actually Latin. Why would Roselli participate in this? Well, it's weird, too, to consider that Sirhan, the supposed assassin of Senator Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, who was going to be president, he worked at Santa Anita, which is the racetrack that was owned by Roselli. And he was like a jockey's helper. So he may have been spotted out. This guy's very impressionable. Let's do an MK Ultra session on him, throw him up there, and really then have Thane Eugene Caesar, who worked at Lockheed, and not only Lockheed, but Lockheed Skunk Works, which was their basic UFO headquarters for redevelopment of UFO materials. That's where Thane Eugene Caesar came from. And Caesar had only been on the job at the Ambassador Hotel for 3 days. So that's unusual, too. He was the one who was directly behind Kennedy. Noguchi, the same person who had been the coroner for Marilyn Monroe and said, no, she didn't OD, but, she did have these drugs in her system. Then he becomes the person who says, no, he wasn't shot by Sirhan because Sirhan was 5 to 8 feet in front of him. Whoever shot him point blank behind the ear. So the only person who was directly behind him was Thane Eugene Caesar, who eventually takes off for the Philippines. So Roselli, before the Robert Kennedy assassination, is coming out with these stories, and he's helping Jack Anderson put this together about, the Kennedys were involved in this intrigue about getting these gangsters to kill Castro. So now we're kind of immune to this after hearing it for so many years. But back in 1967, that was a bombshell. Nobody knew anything about it. So somebody was blackmailing somebody there, or they were trying to keep Kennedy away from even attempting the White House. Whatever it was, Kennedy didn't listen, and he decided to go for it. And what's interesting is, as soon as he decides to go for it, Lyndon Johnson says, I'm not going to run for re-election, which no president has ever done. They all run. They may not get in, but they certainly won't just sign off, except, of course, Nixon had to resign. So here's LBJ saying, I won't seek the presidency. Well, he knows, look, if I'm the beneficiary of 2 Kennedy assassinations, somebody's going to investigate. And so Bobby announces in early March 31st, LBJ is out. So it's a wide open field for Bobby, and Bobby's gaining momentum, and he's doing fantastic. And finally, he wins the California primary, which is the huge piece over Eugene McCarthy. And that's the end. That will be the end, really, of the contest. It's going to move to Chicago. And what he says is, it's on to Chicago and let's win there. Well, it never makes it to Chicago because he's assassinated by Thane Eugene Caesar. Now, I did a whole documentary on this called UFO File Assassins, which includes all the stuff about Roselli and Thane Eugene Caesar. I highly recommend that. It's in the Steganography Cinema playlist. That's on my channel here. Now, what I will say to just summarize the whole thing is that the person that was used there, I was able to be in touch with someone named John Meyer. I was in touch with his son, and John Meyer was in Canada. He had fled the United States, and he knew that Howard Hughes, through Bob Mayhew, that Bob Mayhew had kind of taken over the Hughes Enterprise and that they had assassinated Bobby Kennedy using Thane Eugene Caesar. And he very innocently, when Thane Eugene Caesar's name came up, he called up Bob Mayhew, who was a CIA personnel who had turned FBI, who had turned private investigator. And then he was a liaison between the mob in Las Vegas and Howard Hughes. And, they had turned Hughes into some kind of MK Ultra patient and were just using his massive money to, organize drugs, arms, and, just really create a central base there. But they were also building Hughes aircraft and Hughes Aerospace, which became fundamentally the runaway company when it came to space. And of course, it got consolidated later. But the upshot of all this is the strangeness around the figures, again, that we find right in the heart of it. It's Roselli, who, again, was right in the heart of the original things that were around Sinatra and Marilyn and all the rest. So Roselli and Giancana show up over and over again. And I was like, it's interesting because here they are in the JFK assassination. Here they are around the Marilyn Monroe thing. Here they are around the Bobby Kennedy assassination. Now, it didn't make sense to me from a purely organized crime level that they would be involved in all of these situations just for the typical things that organized crime is involved for: drugs, prostitution, territory, whatever it would happen to be. So what we know from the description of the deep state from Professor Peter Dale Scott, who really kind of put it on the record, was that the organized crime, and we have this upside down very often, but basically organized crime is at the level of the totem pole underneath the intelligence agencies, that they give them instructions on what to do, and that's how it was established a long time ago. And that above the intelligence agencies are those financial interests that are around the world, the international finance piece that came, the international finance that would come into Manhattan. And then the groups that were handled around intelligence that dealt with contracting, like Booz Allen Hamilton, for example, who have even less of a leash on them than the intelligence agencies. So the idea of people like Roselli, being right in the heart of this over and over again really got me thinking. And then by the time we get around to the Kennedy hearings, they assassinate both of them. So they were the disposable kind of muscle on the ground, as it were. They were also the potential fall guys because they were involved in one way or another for a number of years with the intelligence agencies. If it ever came down that the CIA was exposed, they could always throw organized crime to it. No, it wasn't us. It was organized crime that bumped off. Isn't it terrible that the Kennedys were involved with those mobsters? So sad. The young president killed by angry mobsters, hiding their role again and the real purpose behind the assassinations in a kind of vengeance, vendetta, double cross type scenario. Go just a little bit further behind and you're going to see what the real motivations are. That's what we're getting to next. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show, X Series 172, Maryland, Deep State, JFK, UFO file mystery. We'll do 5 minutes on this I.B. Hale piece, and then we'll jump into your questions.
Sounds good.
How's it going out there?
This is very intriguing. Simon Kerr says, is talking to Joseph. It says there's a big connection between Ava Gardner and Otto Skorzeny and Nazi International, parties in Madrid. She liked powerful men. That is something to follow up on.
Oh, wow. Yeah. Ava had very strange connections, and she also was close with Hemingway.
Yes.
Here's a quick thing about I.B. Hale. And you might even think, why would you mention I.B. Hale? This is where I think it all comes right into the heart of it. And, we've done a lot, and we're going to do more on the Antarctica piece, which is that the person who was, where the patsy was stationed in the Texas School Book Depository in the JFK assassination, he had a huge connection through his cousin, Admiral Byrd to the whole Antarctica piece, and then went to Antarctica as soon as the assassination was over. But he owned Ling Temco Vout, and that company was a big experimental space company. What's interesting is when Lee Harvey Oswald is showing up to work, he is walking into a building owned by the guy who runs an experimental aerospace company. Well, here's the other weird one. And the signature goes right in through Exner and Marilyn, and I'll show you how. I.B. Hale, two-time All-American football tackle for Texas Christian University in Fort Worth, co-captain of 1938 team. He played professional football, but ended up as the head of the FBI office in North Texas. Then a security chief for General Dynamics plant. He was a country club scion and married into wealth. He also had a troubled family. One of his twin sons, Bobby, was the biggest trouble of all. Bobby was dating one of his classmates at Arlington Heights High School in Fort Worth. Who went there? Lee Harvey Oswald. Kathleen K.K. Connolly, the daughter of Fort Worth lawyer and eventual Texas Governor John Connolly. In 1959, Bobby and K.K. eloped to Oklahoma, then moved to Tallahassee against their family's wishes. After 44 days of marriage, K.K. was dead, having been fatally shot. Bobby Hale testified that they had argued that she had pointed the 20-gauge shotgun at her head and that he had lunged for it, and the gun accidentally went off. He got off, but John Connolly had lost a daughter. John Connolly at the time was not governor of Texas. As a matter of fact, he became governor of Texas only in 1963, just in time to show up and be governor to be in the Kennedy assassination car. But Hale, being the head of General Dynamics, they were very forcefully trying to get the TFX fighter contracts through the Kennedy administration. And they were putting a lot of pressure on him. And what they had decided to do was send out the twins to go on an intelligence mission, basically. And so there's a story of these FBI agents who are staking out Judith Exner's apartment for J. Edgar Hoover because they know that Kennedy is seeing her. And eventually Hoover will confront Kennedy and say, just so you know, and so you know in case your enemies are manipulating you about it, you are sharing a girlfriend with the top mobster in the country, and trying to kind of signify, now I can blackmail you. And by the way, you can't make me retire or resign, which Kennedy was planning to do. So what happens is these twins are observed by FBI agents breaking into Judith Exner's apartment, either to find damaging information to blackmail Kennedy with, or to place bugs there to get damaging information that way, and to be able to blackmail the Kennedy administration into giving them these fighter contracts. The fighter contract for this very special experimental fighter and aerospace project would eventually become the basis now for Pine Gap in Australia. So you see, that's the Area 51 of Australia, which we've covered on this program. Now, let's get our heads wrapped around some of the players here. These two twins, if you go back into their history a little bit, were known, and there was something noted in their high school log about having a huge fight, that both twins, with Lee Harvey Oswald when he's 15 years old in relation to a football thing or whatever. So here we have this I.B. Hale guy. He's got two sons. They meet Lee Harvey Oswald in high school. They have a fight with him. So there's some record of contact with them. Now here they are, and they're using their dad's car for this intelligence mission of breaking in to Judith Exner's apartment. Now, the FBI goes back to their supervisor and says, what do you want me to do? They're breaking in. He says, no, let them do it and track them. See where they go. Now, the next part of the story is my own interpretation. But if you look at that story of their break-in, it takes place 2 days before Marilyn Monroe's suicide. If these guys were trying to plant information or get information in order to exploit the Kennedys in relation to this aerospace project. You know, they're this close when they're at Judith Exner's LA apartment to here's Marilyn's Brentwood apartment, not very far. So if this happens 2 days before, what do you think is their next target? In my mind, if these guys were on this mission, these twins, as it were, their next stop would have been Maryland's. And I think that gets us into interesting territory because Maryland was being bugged very heavily. We don't know if you think of what these guys could have been up to. But for me, that part hangs out there. And it's interesting because Robert Hale, the son, will eventually become this crazy cult leader. And he will go to New Mexico. And he's the one who had married Connolly's daughter. And then she dies in a weird rifle accident. He's also the same one who broke into Judith Exner's apartment. Something a little too strange hanging out there. And there he is after, all these abuses are found at his cult. He takes off from New Mexico. By the way, Jack Nicholson is a member for a while, but he takes off from New Mexico and he goes to Alaska. And they become very suspicious of him. Finally, it's revealed, with his 20 kids or whatever, all this weird sexual assault and the cult and all the rest of it. That's I.B. Hale's son, the same guy who broke into Judith Exner's apartment.
I didn't expect this.
I know. We got Charlie Manson right in the mix of it. So there's a lot more for us to dive into. But as you can see, what we're looking at, and I'll read in the course of our questions, the UFO document that I have here from NSA surveillance of Marilyn. Very interesting indeed. But before I do that, with that, Miss Olivia, I turn the floor over to you and your questions.
Okay, God, I don't even know where to start. Okay, well, Quantum Paradox says the mafia and the deep state goes hand in hand, and David Tormina says organized crime and the CIA go together like bacon and eggs.
Well, this is funny. Yeah. You have to look at it and say, how do we get to a place there where all of this can be explained through organized crime, right? It's neglecting this other, it's sort of like this gigantic 600-pound elephant in the room. What is the other shoe to drop in all the middle of this? Well, look, when we're in the 2024 election, there's a lot of weird parallels that are going on. One, I do believe that there's a deep state aspect involved around the Trump presidency, and also a deep space aspect around the Trump presidency. I also believe that the Biden forces are so in line with the deep state, there's no way to tell the difference between the two anymore. It's the deep state that's running the country. And then, strangely enough, we have this echo of the Kennedys and the candidacy of Robert Kennedy. And I went on the record last week saying I think that Robert Kennedy should, at a certain point, the summary sort of made the point that he should get out of the race and throw his support to Trump so that those swing states don't suddenly flip through any kind of voter fraud to the Stepford Biden administration. And that Biden regime cannot be allowed to exploit the fact that the throw the bums out vote gets split by the two opposing parties. That's not a good solution. It doesn't get anybody anywhere. And I don't think Bobby came into this race to run for that. And he's brought up a lot of good issues, and he can take that all into 28 and wait for 28 should be his mantra. Because there's no chance of him taking 270 electoral votes in this election, but Trump can. So that's where he should throw his effort. And it's interesting because it leaked out that Trump was considering him for EPA commissioner, which I found interesting. And I think that Trump could use RFK, and I think that RFK does have some great ideas, and I would like to see him come back in 2028 when the fields are clear. After all, Trump can only run for another term anyway, a step for Biden also. So 2028 is a wide open field, and I think Bobby's made the point with it. And I do not think that, tilting the board consciously or not, of a place like Michigan or Wisconsin into the Biden column. Bobby himself said if he got out of the race, that 57% of his support goes to Trump. He knows that in the general election, his candidacy has a worse effect on the Trump campaign. And I say that about Bobby, liking Bobby and his campaign ideas. I think the campaign, Shanahan and some of these things were really bad moves. And I don't think that the attacks on Trump were smart. After all, you want the president's job, which is crazy Biden. And, Biden was at those D-Day things. He just didn't know where he was. I mean, this is insane. So that, Stepford Biden regime situation is using the presidency to have their DOJ attack their political opponents. I mean, it is turning us into a banana republic. But here, in the middle of all this, you are finding us right in this situation again, where you're kind of dealing with the same exact forces at a graduated level. There's a hidden aerospace aspect in the middle of all this. There's certainly deep state shenanigans around drugs and guns and all the rest of it that are going on. There's the exploitation of the war, in this case, Ukraine, previously Vietnam. And, we have a Kennedy directly involved, but we have Trump also representing that nexus, as Kennedy was sort of in between, which, there was a mob factor involved in those elections. So there's an incredible echo that you can just feel when you tune into this election. It's so crucial, the way the 1960 election was so crucial. And I think if Nixon had got in 1960, that we would have had a nuclear exchange, because Kennedy handled the Cuban Missile Crisis so beautifully. And I'll tell you what, in 4 days, there are going to be 4 Russian warships in Havana. I'm not kidding around. This is what's happening. The craze in the hot zone is going hot. And it's because of the nature of the Biden situation and, them doubling down. Biden apologized to Zelensky on stage today and said, "Oh, I'm sorry that the Republicans held this up. I've approved 6 more payments for you." He can't approve anything. He says, "I'm signing off on $250 million for you today." We don't want him to give them any more money. We don't want a nuclear war. We don't want any of that Ukraine psycho situation, the Obama, Clinton, Biden freak show, deep state freak show. So the only thing that I think we can do at this level is, we know the first thing that Trump will do when he gets into office is firm up the border, get rid of all those people that Biden has smuggled in here, God knows, to overthrow the country. And he knows how to stop the Ukraine war. He doesn't have the empire building thing going on. So for a fact there's a constitutional edge to that. It's, the choice there is becoming very clear. And I think at this point in the campaign, we have to step up on that and be real, that the country cannot take the Stepford Biden administration for 4 more years. It just can't happen. Yes.
Okay, so Golden Girl says, "These guys are no saints." Najat Madri says, "Sounds like not much has changed." And BW says, "The lurid details are always a distraction from the real truth."
It's true. I mean, I think with Marilyn, you can start off with this, which is, she was an incredible talent who rose out of very minimal, limited circumstances and became a megastar. And that the people around her at that level, in entertainment, in organized crime, in politics, wanted to use those things that she had attained. But she's a remarkable figure, as is JFK. And, people can say things in relation to JFK and talk about his womanizing and all these different things. But, I will also, you have to go hand in hand with that and say, if you really think of the amount of things that Kennedy did that saved the country, and think of the people that have held that office, like Bush or whatever. I mean, Kennedy really made a huge difference, and his focus was freedom, and he had a vision, a real vision for the future. But I think the things that need to come to light are related to the advanced technology piece. The exotic UFO technology aspect. This is what's missing in the conversation when you get around these historical pieces. That's what needs to be brought on board to understand what the deep state is about, and also why the incredible resistance to Trump, because of Trump's big kind of deep connection through his uncle into the X technology. It's there, it's obvious, and it's directly connected to the UFO file through Vannevar Bush, who ran the UFO file. That's what we're talking about. Yes, Miss Olivia.
Okay. Ryan Perella says, wow, Thane Caesar that RFK Jr. said killed his father was attached to Skunkworks? Wow. Garrison was right. It all leads to paperclip players. Katie Cat says JFK wanted to register the Israeli lobby as foreign entity and wanted to prevent their nuclear program. Soon after he was dead, he was considered a threat to the Zionist agenda, CIA, and Mossad target. And Wally Tango Foxtrot says Permindex a Bronfman Rockefeller connection?
Yes. Well, see, Permindex, the only way to get Permindex we can liken, what can we really liken it to? It's kind of like the Davos get together, but it is a very targeted group of individuals, and they came out through the idea of the World Trade Centers in order to operate these enclaves of communication. So the Bilderberg Group is something akin to Permindex. And I remember one time I was talking with Dr. Farrell about this, and he came up with the idea that the name itself was unusual and that it may represent the idea of a permanent index of individuals that were assassinated or were to be assassinated, which makes more sense to me than permanent industrial revolution centers. But what's interesting, Permindex, their operations, since they were thrown out of Europe, became centered in Canada. And a couple of years ago, I tracked down a number of court cases involving Bloomfield's papers, which very much play in Canada like the JFK files play in America. They're there, they're the stealth archives, but we don't know how to get our hands on them. And but we are aware of it, just like the Kennedy files. We know that the Kennedy files are there. We know that Trump said to Judge Napolitano, whose trip to Russia was recently canceled because they grabbed his friend Scott Ritter off a plane for no reason and grabbed his passport and said, no, you're not going over there to talk to Tara Reid, who had accused Biden of assaulting her. No. So, we have to kind of look at these things in context and see, well, what we're looking at is there's a number of fall guys that have been out there at times, but somehow the records and things like Bloomfield's records are like a chip. They're like one of those chips in a poker game, that the ultimate ace in the hole, so that everyone knows they're there, but since nobody can get at them, one of the things I put on the record about stealth archives is, and this is pretty interesting, which is that there's a 1957 study that the Rockefellers did on the UFO file. And it was done in succession with a number of their economic studies and their studies on race relations, urban studies, and all the rest of it. They did a group of these. Kissinger was involved in 1956 and 1957. And what happened was, that part got pushed away, the UFO thing. And they said, no, we put the other ones out in the book, but we're not going to put the UFO file one out. No one even knew that it existed. And then it came about through different investigations that they had done this whole thing and that Kissinger was the lead man on it. So, there's a whole stealth archive of the Rockefellers putting out this huge effort around the UFO file and having major brain trust of Harvard and these other universities involved. So, these are the things. These are the stealth archives, just like the LBJ-X letter, which was supposed to have been released, as we know, in the last year and never made it for some reason. The LBJ library is just like, we don't have to do it. But I'm sure with a number of these presidents, just like the Nixon thing, there's, we were involved with the UFO file up to this point. So when it comes out, their level, their place is revealed in it. And they may have also used it for leverage. Yes.
Okay. Melissa J. would love to know if Marilyn had a diary that was taken the night of her death.
Yeah, this is this is what a lot of this was about, apparently. But also, what's interesting, I'm glad you mentioned that, because I mentioned Fred Otash, who was the private investigator and had started Confidential Magazine and all the rest. Otash is very interesting because he's the one who goes to Jeannie Carmen and says to her, after Marilyn's death, you have to get out of town and just don't even think about it. And actually pulls a gun on her and stuff and throws her around. This guy, later in life, he says, he started to hedge and haw about things in the 80s and say, yeah, I don't think that Marilyn intended to commit suicide, but he's stopping short of saying in public that it's murder. Then finally he comes out and says, no, it was murder. And then he says, I know how it was done. I was listening. And then he says, I know the last calls that she made and all the rest of it. And nobody could have doubted it. So he decided, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to put out Me, Marilyn, and the Kennedys, the book, and I'm going to tell the whole story. It's 1990, the time has come for me to do this. And he completes a version, and he goes out and he parties with some friends because they have the first edited version that they're going to publish. And then he goes back, and out of the blue, he orders a cab for the airport at 2:00 in the morning. And nobody knows where he's going to go, but the cab's out there beeping. Nothing ever happens. They go upstairs. He's dead on the floor of a heart attack. So whatever he took with him to his grave is pretty interesting. So there was a writer, his name escapes me right now, but I'll think of it before we're done, who did a series of novels using him as a central character. And this is after the Chinatown movie and all that. It was in the 90s. And his daughter, Otash's daughter, gets so upset that she says, you know what? I have a file vault of his files. And I can tell you that none of the stuff that you're putting out there about him is true. He was doing his surveillance, trying to sort of portray him in an altruistic fashion. And what she did by doing this was she confirmed a number of the details. For example, that he was the one listening in at the end. And some of the things that he said about what he heard was that Bobby Kennedy had come earlier and they had had a huge fight. He had left, and that they were looking for this diary of hers, which she had kept in very loose details. As I said, I think there may have been things that were related to projects, and I think that they knew that she was bugged and that if she was talking about this stuff, it was a problem. But they say that after that, people came to visit her and, basically drugged her, roughed her up, and killed her. So there are things on record now that weren't on record then. One of them is the ambulance driver who said he got a call at 3:30 in the morning to go there. Now, there's another story about how they have a record of an ambulance going there 2 hours before that, taking her to the hospital. She dies in the hospital. Then they bring her back and stage the death scene. That's one story. This guy has a different story, which is that he's driving his ambulance about 3:15. He gets a call. He's right around the corner with another man. They go in, and they find her in a little bedroom on a totally different part of the house. And that her press agent is jumping up and down, and she's saying, you have to go in there because I think she's dead. And they go in there and they're like, she's acting, very out of it. And her vital signs are down, but she doesn't have anything around her mouth that you would see in an overdose. and they're not seeing that she took pills. So they resuscitate her, and she's starting to bring some color back, and she's still alive. And then this man comes in, who eventually is identified as Dr. Greenson, says, "I'm her doctor. I can stimulate her with this." And he pulls out this long needle that already has the heart attachment on it, and that he shoves it into her rib. It cracks the rib, and he pulls it into this weird angle, and that she dies right after that. So, this whole scene is played out, and then his partner, the ambulance partner, won't confirm his story, but he shuts up and he goes underground. And this guy comes out, he gives his story, and he goes through hypnosis about it. In the 70s, he comes out and he does lie detector tests, and he's totally honest. But the other ambulance driver who disappeared, it will be noted that his later driving partner, he will tell the story and say, "I was paid a lot of money to shut up. That's why I own all these car washes and stuff. They wanted me to pay off. The only thing was I had to keep doing this low-level job so nobody would ask any questions." And he said, "I won't tell you the whole story, but yeah, I went to Marilyn's house that night and she was still alive. We went in there at 3:30." So that confirmed the ambulance driver's story. So there's a lot of things on record now. The original story that she killed herself with drugs and all the rest of it is complete nonsense. It's completely untrue. And the question that lingers is why they portrayed it that way. Well, what's also interesting is over time, the maid, the housekeeper, she changed her story, and her story has got to include more of the real facts. And at a certain point, she said, "Yeah, Bobby Kennedy had shown up earlier that night." And she'd say, "Oh yeah, there was an ambulance." So she, little by little, the story started to come out. Her original story was complete bunk. "Oh, I saw a light on, I was worried, I called the doctor. He broke in through the window." And I said, "Why did it take you 3 hours to call the police?" "Oh, I don't have a good answer for that." So it's an extraordinary cover story, but the original story and what you would read about it traditionally is total bunk. The problem is the story that it's replaced with, that they're trying to replace it with, the Kennedys killed Marilyn or whatever it was. That is a CIA cover piece that's being laid out there on top. And, that's where the junk conspiracy comes in. Yes.
Do you want to mention the vacations that they went on?
Which vacations?
That the housekeeper went on?
Oh, that's right. Very interesting. Both the housekeeper and her female and Marilyn's female press agent, who was freaking out, both went on world trips, international trips for 3 months, basically got out of town after the suicide.
First class trips.
Quote unquote. Yeah. Here's the document. It's a very obscure little piece in relation to the UFO file. And it comes from surveillance that was NSA surveillance of Marilyn Monroe. So the FBI is tuning in there. Hoff is tuning in. Yeah, a lot of people are very interested. Well, let's see what we have here on this document. So the person in charge is talking about how she had been in touch with Dorothy Kilgallen and was giving her information about things that she knew. And this is what worried them. And I'll just read a little bit of this. Rothberg discussed the apparent comeback of this subject. Now, the subject is Robert Kennedy and then something to do with space. Rothberg said Kilgallen said that she was attending Hollywood parties hosted by the inner circle among Hollywood's elite and was becoming the talk of the town again. Rothberg indicated in so many words that she had secrets to tell, Marilyn, that is, no doubt arising from her trysts with President Kennedy and the Attorney General. One such secret mentions the visit by the president at a secret airbase for the purpose of inspecting things from outer space. Kilgallen replied that she knew what might be the source of the visit. In the mid-50s, Kilgallen learned of a secret effort by the U.S. to identify the origins of a crashed spacecraft and dead bodies from a British government official. Kilgallen believed this story, that the story may have come from the New Mexico story in the late 40s. That's Roswell, not known by anyone else at that point. Kilgallen said that if the story were true, it would create tremendous embarrassment for Jack and his plans to have NASA put men on the moon. The subject, Marilyn, repeatedly called the Attorney General and complained that the way she was being ignored by the president and his brother, Marilyn threatened to hold a press conference that would tell all. Marilyn made reference to bases in Cuba and knew of the president's plan to kill Castro. Subject made reference in her diary of secrets of what the newspapers would do with such disclosures. An indented block of text is redacted near the bottom of the page, and the document is sent to James Angleton. So, the NSA surveillance document piece, which came out, there's about 4 documents. One's an FBI document that reference this project or UFO file connection with what the problem was in relation to Marilyn. It was picked up in relation to something. They were looking for something totally different, apparently, in FBI and NSA circles, and they got this, which is, oh no, he's talking to her about that, and she wants to maybe have a press conference about their relationship, but is this going to come up? And that somehow in this process, if we go now to the Giancana information, Giancana tells his brother, the CIA told me that I was going to have to interfere and that I was going to have to bump her off and that they were hiring me basically to do this. And, these were the reasons for it, because the very thing that they wanted me to do, get involved in doing their assassinations, her talking, was going to get in the middle of this. And that even he was saying, I don't think she's going to talk or whatever. So, the upshot from Giancana's information is that the CIA hired him to remove Marilyn off the board, and that there were forces in there, aspects of the mob and Hoffa, who wanted to use that to exploit Bobby Kennedy's situation with her and basically demean both of the Kennedys. But the CIA wasn't done with them yet, and they didn't want to remove them through this, which would be something that would reveal their own workings in the deep state. They wanted to do it their own way. So she was getting in the way of that by threatening to do this thing. Maybe she wouldn't have done it, but she made enough noise that she was going to. That becomes maybe the most believable, most plausible out of all those stories. And her committing suicide was always, in my mind, very, very sketchy. I never believed that.
There were no pills in her stomach. You don't need to go any further
right.
than
Noguchi,
that.
I think, cleared that one up for us. And I think, when you look back on it, that Jeannie Carmen claimed that Roselli had told her that Giancana had done it. And in her book, when, she put a book out at the end of her life about these things, that's where she went with it. So she also thought that the Kennedys had gotten her into, a very bad situation and a bad field of things. I will say this about people on this level, that you can both be so big and so talented that you can kind of cancel each other out. And so it's like the Kennedys were doing one thing, Marilyn was doing another. She was fantasizing about this larger thing of being in the White House and being the first lady and all that. And they were, being these kind of political guys on one hand, but then just like their dad, being able to rule the roost in Hollywood. And you can see there's a weird thing there, because somehow neither is really fulfilling their role for the other. And there's a weird canceling out. Like oddly enough, they had a negative impact on each other. That's what I think is one of the most fascinating things there. Both mega talents. Yes.
Long Lost Cousin says Widespread Panic by James Elroy is all about
That's it.
Fred Otash.
Yes, that is the book where they take Otash and really bring out a whole character in him. And, Elroy is totally clear that it's all fiction, but he drew from what he knew about Otash and created this. And that's why Otash's daughter said, I'm going to release some of these files. But nobody knew where the whereabouts of those files. They had all disappeared. And apparently they'd been taken by Otash's lawyer. And remember, again, just for context, Otash was the private eye who kind of got all the sleaze in Hollywood. And he was hired, though, by the mafia, by the actors themselves. And he had been, by the publisher of Confidential magazine, the two of them had put together this incredible, salacious publication that could bring anybody out and bring anybody down. So they were definitely, they were powerhouses of their day. That guy kept incredible files, and he had worked in law enforcement, so he knew how the whole thing operated. And in fact, he had worked for Marilyn at a certain point. And even Jeannie Carmen was like, oh, yeah, I always thought of him as a friend, But by the time of Marilyn's murder, then he had to really, put the fear of God into Jeannie Carmen to get her out of town. And it worked, interestingly enough. Yes, Miss Olivia.
James Elroy wrote LA Confidential.
Yes. And he is a very strange guy if you've seen interviews of him, but his books are quite good. I'll say that. Yes.
Okay, so where was I here? Okay, Carpenter Helper X says Johnny Russo, mobster and actor in The Godfather, said that JFK and RFK forced Marilyn Monroe to abort RFK's baby, which led to her bleeding out and dying. Although I know you don't believe that, there were rumors that she had been pregnant, that she was asked, and she did abort the child, yes?
What's interesting, and again, this follows in pattern in that period of time, because Judith Exner also becomes pregnant with JFK's baby. But what's interesting is JFK doesn't tell her to have an abortion or anything like that, but she ends up doing it, and then she can prove later that in 1962 she had a spontaneous abortion in this. Now, this is 10 years before it was legal, but it just happened.
No, she had a DNC, which actually was code for an abortion back in the day.
Right. And what it says is spontaneous abortion on the medical receipt. But
right. That's how you get away with it.
Yeah, I think so. I'm sure that these things came up, and one of the people, I think it was the person who was the Hoffa's guy who was listening in. He's the one who said that she had complained and had said she was pregnant with Robert's kid. So it's possible that had happened, but there's only so much on that one. So oddly enough, yes, what do you got?
I just wanted to throw this in here that Ray Nabosny says Marilyn was ABRH negative, which I know everyone will be excited about.
She's a very unusual person.
I'll tell you something I learned is that Marilyn had, I've been watching videos about her all week. She had a lot of peach fuzz, the most peach fuzz of any actress. And the studio wanted her to kind of shave it down, and she wouldn't do it because what it did is the light reflected off of it and created a halo, like a glow around her face. So it made her look more luminous with the makeup on than if she just had it removed, which I think is fascinating.
Well, we know that she had a lot of interesting superstitions. For example, if she got a role on a particular day and she felt like it was a good luck day, she wouldn't change the outfit for 3 days. There's a lot of kind of artsy bohemian qualities, maybe the things that she picked up in Greenwich Village when she went there to study acting. But there's certainly an interesting quality that she has there that makes her almost an early beatnik, and so the image is all the gowns and all the rest of it, but underneath we see the person at the actor's studio, walking around in sunglasses and a weird headdress kind of thing, in disguise, as it were.
Yeah, she had a tiny wardrobe. She rewore the same stuff constantly. She was not a fashionista. When she would go to events, she would borrow pieces that she actually wore that the studio had made for her. She wouldn't she didn't have fancy dresses and furs and all this.
Interesting. Wow.
She wore jeans and pants and tops, and she just was a very casual person.
Yeah, I happen to think that says a lot about who she was underneath. And I've always thought she was a particularly, like misread in a sense, because it seems to me there's an incredible intelligence operating under there. And she, there was a whole thing about Arthur Miller, and they asked him about her after the fact, and he said, well, the thing that people don't understand is how courageous she really was, coming from the background that she did, a half dozen foster homes and being abused when she was very young. An exceptional person who had deep interests and really made it to this incredible level of worldwide celebrity, which was, she was at the top of her craft, and, strangely had a very lonely life, while at the same time having affairs with presidents and, different types of groups like the mob or intelligence agencies trying to use her for different things. It's quite remarkable, the impact that she made. And, I think she knew a lot about her own image, and she knew what worked and how to control what was out there about her. And if you listen to interviews with her, it's interesting the way, there's a lot of glamour on top, but there's a real calculator underneath all of it.
Man, well, she was sly. One thing you probably won't want me to mention this, but one thing I found out about her is that she would actually sew marbles or three buttons into her bras, so that you get the idea. And so clever girl. Darla Cash said Susan Strasberg, daughter of Lee Strasberg, who was Marilyn's acting coach, actually inherited her estate. To answer that question from earlier.
That's interesting. Yeah.
I could see that.
Yeah, there's a few things that happened with it, but I think that's one of them for sure.
And Lee Strasberg is, it was interviewed after her death and really remarked what an incredible actress she was, that she had barely tapped her potential.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good point.
He was very impressed with her.
Yes, he thought that she was the most natural, sensitive actress, and he said the only other person that compared in his mind was Marlon Brando, which is interesting because I've never been a fan of Marlon Brando, but that's fascinating.
But he is an incredible actor.
That is a shot of Exner at the end, and I guess we all owe her a huge service for everything that she tried to do for Kennedy in that period, and also putting up with all the incredible flack and danger that she had to put up with later. Just a remarkable woman. That's her with her son. And I wanted to mention that information has come out now that Clay Shaw had come looking at a relative, the Murrats, who were involved with the mafia, relative of Lee Harvey Oswald, that Clay Shaw had come to visit in September of 1963. And Mark Lane's in the report as well. This is something that I think you're going to hear more about it, but I think that now Garrison's case about Clay Shaw is going to be vindicated, at least to the point that he knew Oswald, which is something that they've always denied in the media and, had so much fun with. Is there anything else I can say about Monroe? From her official bio, it's interesting. So her name was Norma Jean Mortensen, actually, in real life. Born in 26, of course, born in LA. But what's fascinating, and especially for those of you who watch Pawgate, her mother was born in Piedras Negras.
Mm-hmm.
Piedras Negras is the Paw Stone. That's where the Hall of Records is supposed to be. How unusual is that? And with that, Miss Olivia, your last question of the night.
I wasn't ready for that.
That's all right.
I'm just going to throw this out there. Fooper Fighter said, does DJ think Joseph Kennedy's sudden health crisis was engineered by his enemies?
No, but I think it changed part of the trajectory of what John Kennedy, I think that, I think Joe would have been more friendly to the mob. And I think that with him having a stroke almost as soon as Jack gets into office, they really run things their way. And, you know, so the influence of Joe, the mob sort of lost whatever, connection that they had going on there. It's interesting though, because we have to remember that JFK watched his dad as SEC commissioner. He watched his dad as ambassador to the UK. He watched his dad as business hawk. He watched his dad as Hollywood impresario. This is the impact. And the father, remember, his great ambition was to run for president. He could not, because he was brought down by the fact that he had said that Hitler and fascism was going to take over. And he made such a mistake as the ambassador to the UK by saying that he lost the job. And he became, the unmentionable. But all the things that JFK had learned from him, he was able to reapply. And, the other piece is, when I mentioned Giancana, and I'm going to bring this all around here, Giancana's Chicago mob, that's Al Capone. He was Al Capone's assistant, low-level chauffeur assistant, but he grew up in the ranks. Jack Ruby comes out of that. Jack Ruby is sent by Giancana to Cuba in 1959 to get a major mobster, Traficante, out of Fidel Castro's Cuban prison. And he does, with bribes and everything else. He sends him on this mission. When he comes back, Giancana says, "You did a really good job. I'll tell you what I'm going to do for you. I'm going to give you your own casinos. You're going to be able to really pump up this nightclub stuff that you're doing." So Chicago, Jack Ruby killing Oswald, Chicago's right in the middle of all this. And remember, there was this assassination plot in Chicago before Dallas, and they had a phony Oswald guy set up as well. And he was an ex-Marine who, felt disgruntled and had mental problems. And he was going to assassinate Kennedy from a high-rise building and all the rest of it. So the CIA had their traps set up all along the way. And oddly enough, and it's mentioned by a Secret Service agent who was, Abraham Bolden, who was the first black Secret Service agent, told a remarkable story. He was somebody who tried to call out the Warren Commission and was put in prison and then pardoned. But he said, it's interesting. We caught this whole assassination plan with this guy who was kind of like an Oswald. And the Secret Service, when they went to this hotel room, there were all these weapons and things. And there was these two foreign guys there, probably Cuban, and they had taken off and stuff. But the landlord had told the Secret Service about them. And the informant's name was Lee. That was the first name. Lee Harvey Oswald may have been the person who was giving them the information. That's why he's sitting in the middle of the Texas School Book Depository while all this is going on. He's the person who's able to give the information out. One of the best, one of the greatest beneficiaries of the assassination was LBJ, who was certainly aware of it and going along with it. But remember, LBJ was Senator NASA. He's right in the heart of the aerospace piece. And his friend Connolly right there next to him. Who was he in with? Well, it's very interesting that I.B. Hale of General Dynamics, I.B. Hale's son, had shot Connolly's daughter. Very strange. And there's a weird pattern there, too. I'll just say this with no explanation, but when Connolly leaves being the, Secretary of the Navy, Fred Korth takes over. And Fred Korth is also involved in a lot of very experimental programs, deep secrecy programs. But Korth's daughter, just like Connolly's daughter, gets shot. And I just found that weird. You have two secretaries of the Navy in succession, and both of them have a teenage daughter that gets shot. Seems kind of a remarkable pattern. Another shot of Joseph Kennedy with his protege, JFK, who became a fine president. And this is a shot of LBJ blackmailing himself onto the ticket. And the Kennedys can't do a damn thing about it because JFK, J. Edgar Hoover is backing him up. JFK was going to pick Senator Symington from Missouri, but the blackmail rush was so heavy that the Kennedys decided not to deal with it, that Nixon was a big enough problem and that they could handle LBJ. Well, LBJ turned out to be a bigger problem than they could have imagined. And the final shot of tonight is JFK, and he's standing with Richard Bissell, who had controlled a lot of the UFO file there. 6'7", the mayor of Area 51. And later, who would they call the mayor of Area 51? Christopher Mellon. Think about that. And with that, Miss Olivia, we are done with tonight's presentation.
Okay, I just want to end with these two comments.
Yes.
Rotten Crypto Bit says the horror of wet work. And Psychic Somatic says there is no bottom to this rabbit hole.
No.
And that's the truth. As well, especially when you get around, oh my God, Marilyn and JFK, forget it, you know?
Oh, absolutely. I have a, there's a lot about Marilyn that I haven't even been able to get to in this. So I'm going to parlay that into a show dealing with celebrities in that era. But I think there's something absolutely fascinating about the impact that somebody like, Sinatra or Marilyn has in dealing directly with that presidential level. And also in the case of Sinatra, being the intermediary between the presidential level, the mob level, it's, and then the incredible entertainment industry. I mean, this is the world that they lived in. What part of the world of this are we still sort of experiencing the echoes of? Well, I can tell you that I don't feel, like 2024 is very much actually like 1960, oddly enough. Even with all the changes in the world, et cetera, the forces that were on the rise in 1960 basically took over. And they removed the other forces, which were the Kennedy forces. And, now you have this push-pull where the deep state controls the Biden administration. You have these other forces, Trump and Kennedy. And I think we get some puzzle pieces there of exactly how this all lays out. And the election is always a time where we can see things deeper, go deeper, and find those levels that will, be like little explosions on the battlefield to show us what's happening. And this is definitely one of those elections, and nobody can be on the sideline for this election. I don't care. I hear it all the time, especially in independent media. Oh, presidential election doesn't matter. It's, it's only your local alderman that's going to make a difference. There's something crazy about this. The titular head of the government is the president. So when that's shut off, like controlled, like Spock's brain, like Stepford Biden, you have a big problem. That means the country is functioning without an actual head. It's a pretend head, and there's this other thing going on. So you need somebody at the top who's going to reflect at least the constitutional principles, not allow an invasion of our southern border. I mean, it's just obvious. So, the choice for president is becoming more and more obvious as the days go by. Yes, Ms. Olivia.
Charlotte Knight says, rabbit hole, more like rabbit abyss. And Bo Krill says, I agree, DJ, 2024 feels final in some way.
Oh, yeah, he's right. He's right. It's a showdown. And the Bragg case, certainly the Jack Smith case, falls into that realm also. I hope, the Bragg case is going to get thrown out. It's the most just absurd. I've talked to legal people from every stripe. The most liberal lawyers in the world would tell you this case is ridiculous. So it's not a partisan thing. And I think that some of the voices out there that are really picking up on things politically, like Gabbard is picking up, she's made the full turn from being a Democrat to supporting Trump in the election going forward and really calling out the Biden administration. That's what Bobby forgot to do. he forgot to excoriate the Biden regime, which he should have. And he has an opportunity to do that, and I think throw his support behind Trump. That's what I would really recommend, so that he can be a factor in 2028 and help Trump at least get rid of the Biden regime. Absolutely. And I think that has to happen. And I don't play politics on this show. I get into and examine these different types of things. But 2024, I would say, is different. That there's no way the banana republic level that we've sunk to under Biden, who's not even really the president. I mean, he's doesn't have a brain to be the president. That's dangerous. And for people in independent media not to call that out, and not and to say, well, don't worry, don't even think about politics or the presidency, do something local. Look, local is great, and you should, but the presidency is important. And the leadership of the world centers around the presidency of the United States. He can negotiate directly with our Russian counterparts, negotiate peace. He can negotiate with Mexico and put a wall up there to stop the invasion. He can stop the Ukraine war. He can stop nuclear tensions. I mean, it is a very important position. And yes.
Oh my God. We have Jeannie Carmen's, Odin Andrews, I'm thinking female, niece is in the chat.
Oh, fantastic. Fantastic.
Wow.
Odin Andrews?
Yes.
Okay.
ODUN.
Fantastic. Odin, if you can email me at dj@darkjournalist.com, I would love to have a conversation with you, because I think Jeannie and her transparency is such a breath of fresh air. And, she was a remarkable thing. I just finished her book, and I found the revelations in it remarkable, but also her own guts coming out and really telling us about these things, I think, was incredible. So
yeah, I just want to say there are a lot of Jeannie Carmen interviews on YouTube.
Yes.
There's one in particular
where
she starts to break down and
cry,
and with guilt that she did not help Marilyn that night. And even though she acknowledges that she herself could have been killed had she done it, but it is so powerful. If you ever have any doubt about her testimony, it will give you chills.
Well, yeah, she was there. There's no question. She was.
Well, she loved Marilyn, clearly.
Yeah, there's no doubt about it. And she took the call, and I think Marilyn supposedly called her around 9:00 and said, asking for sleeping pills because she couldn't sleep because she was so wound up from all the events, things that were happening. And Jeannie was like, I can't help you, because she didn't live close by anymore. She, she was in the city, and Marilyn lived in Brentwood. So it's one of those things that happened there. But it is true. Had she shown up, we don't know how things would have gone. So, but a remarkable story, and her own story, her own crisscrosses with some of the same people, is quite remarkable. And she showed a lot of spunk as an actress as well. A couple of shots, parting shots there. That is Marilyn with Joe DiMaggio. And they do say they had some happy days there for a while, but he couldn't take her acting career, and you know how that goes. And I already showed this one, but that is Marilyn with the shot of Abraham Lincoln, which I think is very telling indeed. And I thought this would crack everybody up. I found a music video of Jeannie Carmen, and she was in George Michael's video of Outside. I don't know what year that would have been, maybe around 2000 or something. But there she is, and she has this guy on a chain up to her old tricks. But Jeannie, yeah,
she's
doing it her way,
broad.
right to the end. And I showed the picture of her with Trump. That is very, very unusual. Let's see. I have another. That is Jeannie Carmen. That's one of her kind of cheesecakey shots.
Ba-ba-boom.
And Trump with Nixon. That is going to come into play probably for the next episode. So think about that. Snapshot that in your mind. And with that, everyone, I'll do a couple of shout outs here.
I've got to thank everybody.
Oh, that's right. Go for it. Yes, yes.
Okay, so let me get to the beginning. Brian Storm, Fulcanelli, Empire of Light, Ilarmanine Bay, the Bikini Truther, Amarillo Gunrunners, Short Order Cook 1, John Folden, Descat Brock, Griffin Eagle 7, Josh Randall, Wonder Without the Fear, Machik, I never know how to pronounce this, Macike 57, Eurythmia's Fun, C.A. Beffer-Forden, Robert Scott, Erica Swenson Elliott, Channelia Hart Barbara Joyce, Jay Parsons, Johnny Ricardo Bown, Bo Krills, and Dalton B. Thank you so much for your generous super chats.
Fantastic. We really appreciate your support for the show, and to all our subscribers, thank you. You keep us going in the work that we do by backing us up with your incredible support, and we appreciate it. And of course, anyone can become a subscriber right at the site. We've made it very affordable for anyone. And it's going to be very important to be a subscriber for all the things we have coming up for you. We will be back with you next week, and watch for some wild breaking news going on this week. We may do some special reports with everything that's going on. I know all these water mains are breaking in everywhere. It happened in Atlanta and all the rest of it. But did you know, did somebody just mention it there? It happened in the Back Bay today here in Boston. So, we're in Cambridge, and Back Bay is just maybe about 15 minutes from here.
Mm-hmm.
So they had all this, water main problem. So this might be the new thing. And I wanted to mention this, that Cambridge now, and I have a lot of good things to say about Cambridge, not great things to say about the governing of Cambridge. But Cambridge is now, when you call the police, they're going to, on half the calls, they're going to send social workers.
Unarmed social workers.
And they're going to be able to work things out, right? So when you see that robbery going on at 7-Eleven, have those social workers come in, and, maybe you can give them a copy of the psychology manual. Or, while they're ducking from bullets, maybe I'll just start reading Shakespeare when the crimes are being committed. Very strange. Cry havoc, and let the stars ring out. Everyone, it's been great to be here with you tonight. And I'll do a couple of shout outs.
Short Order Cook says they're bringing crystals and sage.
I love that. They should do it, hey, just bring like a Eugene O'Neill play and see if that'll calm the situation down. Tim Houston, Jessica Rodriguez, great show tonight. Thank you very much. It's great to have you here with us. And let's see who else we've got. Hats Power, Psychic Somatics. That's great. Thank you for all that you do. And I know Gigi just did a show, and I have to watch that one because it looks like it's going to be very interesting. Of course, Gigi Young, excellent shows out there. Roosevelt Media. This is my favorite show. Thanks, DJ and Olivia. I love this show, Project Redfoot. Thank you very much. We love having you here. And for everyone, Valerie Airy, thanks, DJ. Great show. And Scarlet Fire, thank you. Nina says, Short Order Cook. What does this say? I've been working and listening. As you say, it never ends. I say it ends too soon. Thanks, DJ and Miss Olivia. No question. Dark Journalist is the best. Thank you, Predator. Golden Girl, Trident Vibes. DJ, you're so amazing, says John Marindino. Gee, thanks. He got a swelled head reading these things.
Hat Powser says, how about a show on Marilyn's 430 books? There is an article called The 430 Books in Marilyn Monroe's Library.
Isn't that fascinating? Absolutely. Joe always brought flowers to her grave. Yes, DiMaggio loved her through and through. There's no question about that. Thank you, Joseph. It's great to see you out there, sir. I know we'll have you on shortly. Can't wait to hear what's up. So interesting, the Jot. Will Gigi save us all? Yeah, well, we have to find that out. Well, she'll let us know. Nanette Chris, Judge Mershon forced to tell Trump alleged cousin of Jura was told he'd be found guilty before. Yes. Started the show with that. And if that's found out to be true, that'll throw that ridiculous case out for real. But even if not, that show, that show trial is going to be overturned. There's no question about it. What an abuse of the legal system. I mean, I think that's low even for that New York Democrat system. And I lived in New York. I love New York, but the the governance system in New York there's a lot of thuggery that goes on. Let's see. Roosevelt feels like, which kind of screw over do I want? Then pick the candidate, right?
Oh, it's great.
Can't beat that. Miss Olivia, bravo. Nicely done. Fantastic job there. If you don't vote, you can't legit gripe since you did nothing. Rose Thistle Artworks. Isn't that the truth? Wow. I know Kate's out there. It's great to see you. Melissa J. But who is the real Shakespeare? Indeed. Francis Bacon, please stand up. Trident Vibes. Listen to Tommy Lee Jones on Men in Black. Most of the aliens in Manhattan. Isn't that interesting? Tommy Lee knows. Research has begun. Clears browser history while waiting. Foxtrot. Griffin Eagle. Yes. Please, please, please look. Yes, Griffin Eagle. For sure. Good old muckraking DJ. Yeah, there was a lot. I realized it's a very detailed, dense presentation tonight, but think of the characters that we're dealing with. Whew. That's not, I feel like, you only start to get to the bottom of things, but there's some very important pieces in tonight's piece. Trident Vibes, Once There Was a Camelot. Indeed. Never let it be forgot. And with that, everyone, I will leave you. And, it says end broadcast, but after all,
Never really ends.
It never really ends. And it's great to have so many of you here tonight with us. Wait, DJ, your hair looks better than ever, my friend.
Awesome.
I love that the hair gets comments. That's nice. Alchemy and Angels. Once There Was a Camelot. It's in the air, isn't it? And once there was a Camelot, and there can be Camelot again. Make no mistake. And the spirit of it is here with us in 2024, as it was in 1960 with John F. Kennedy. We will see you all next week, and never let it be forgot.
God bless everybody.
Have a great night, everyone. See you next week. Have a great weekend.